They say an alpha's greatest weapon is his ruthlessness, but nobody warned Kale Draven that his destruction would arrive in chains, bleeding and broken, with eyes that could see straight through to the rotting core of his empire. The prophecy promised him an enemy. Fate delivered him a mate. And in the space between execution and obsession, the most feared king in the realm would discover that some curses don't kill you. They save you from becoming the monster you were always meant to be. Stay until the end to see how an Omega destined to die becomes the only one who can make a king feel alive. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. Let me know where my pack is watching from tonight. The iron door to Celine Vale's cell had been opened exactly 3 times in her 22 years. Once when she was born and her mother died screaming. Once when the pack healer confirmed the mark on her spine. 3 crescent moons arranged like claws raking down her vertebrae. And once when they came to drag her to the Alpha King's judgment. She didn't fight the chains. Fighting had stopped making sense around the time she turned 15 and realized the Bloodfang pack would rather watch her starve than waste good meat on a cursed Omega. The guards hauled her through corridors that stank of wet stone and old blood. Her bare feet left smears on the floor. Somewhere above, she could hear the roar of a crowd. Hundreds, maybe thousands of voices baying for violence the way wolves howled at a full moon. So this is how it ends, she thought. Not with ceremony, not with mercy, just meat for the beast. The prophecy had been whispered in dark corners for generations. An Omega bearing the moonborn mark would rise with power enough to shatter every Alpha throne in the realm. When Kyle Draven began his conquest 3 years ago, tearing through territories like wildfire through dead grass, the old prophecy crawled out of legend and became policy. Find the marked Omega. Kill her before she wakes. Celine had never wanted power. She wanted to heal the sick. She wanted to grow herbs in sunlight. She wanted to exist without every breath being counted as borrowed time. The guards shoved her through a final doorway, and she stumbled into an arena so vast it seemed to swallow sound itself. Torches lined the walls in perfect rows, their flames casting shadows that writhed like living things. Stone seats rose in tiers on every side, packed with wolves in human form. Alphas and betas dressed in furs and leather, their eyes gleaming with bloodlust barely contained by skin. At the far end of the arena, on a throne carved from a single massive stone, sat Kale Draven, the Alpha King. Even from a distance, even with her vision blurred from 3 days without water, Celine could feel the weight of him. He wasn't the largest man she'd ever seen, but he radiated presence like heat from a forge. Dark hair pulled back from a face that could have been handsome if it wasn't so utterly devoid of warmth. Scars crossed his jaw and disappeared beneath the black fur draped across his shoulders. His eyes, pale gray, almost silver, tracked her movement with the fixed attention of a predator deciding which bone to crack first. The guards forced her to her knees 10 feet from the throne. The chains rattled. The crowd noise died to nothing. Kale Draven stood. When he moved, it was with the fluid economy of someone who'd been killing since childhood. He descended 3 steps and stopped just beyond the reach of her chains. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Celine lifted her chin. If she was going to die, she'd do it meeting his eyes. She'd given the Bloodfang pack 22 years of groveling. She had nothing left to apologize for. Kale's nostrils flared. Something flickered across his face. Confusion, maybe anger, and then his expression went blank as stone. "Show me the mark," he said. His voice was deep, rough-edged, the kind of sound that didn't ask twice. One of the guards grabbed the back of Celine's ragged shirt and tore it open. Cold air hit her spine. She heard the crowd lean forward, a collective intake of breath. The 3 crescent moons blazed silver against her skin, each one perfect and terrible, arranged in a pattern that seemed to shift in the torchlight. Kyle stared at the mark for what felt like an eternity. Then he raised one hand. Silence crashed over the arena like a physical weight. "The council advised me to execute this Omega immediately," Kyle said, his voice carrying to every corner of the space. "They cited the prophecy. They called her a threat to the stability of the realm." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Celine could see members of Kyle's council seated to the left of the throne, gray-haired alphas with eyes like chips of ice, watching her the way men watched a rabid dog. "But the council," Kyle continued, "is not king." The murmurs died. Confusion replaced bloodlust in the watching faces. Kael circled Celine slowly, his boots silent on the stone floor. This Omega is a healer, yes? That was your role in the Bloodfang pack? Celine's throat was so dry, her voice came out like gravel. I tried to be. Tried? Kael stopped in front of her again. Did you fail? The pack didn't want healing from cursed hands, so they starved you instead, kept you locked in darkness, treated you like a weapon that might go off if it saw too much sunlight. It wasn't a question. Kael tilted his head slightly, studying her with those pale predator eyes. How many did you heal before they stopped you? 17. The number came out before Celine could stop it. 17 warriors, 4 children. 2 were dying when I touched them. They lived. And your reward was chains. My reward was not being killed immediately. A sound came from Kael's chest. Not quite a laugh, darker than amusement. He turned to address the crowd. Fear makes wolves stupid. The Bloodfang pack had a healer who could resurrect the dying, and they locked her in a cell because of words spoken by ancestors who've been dust for 200 years. This is what happens when prophecy becomes policy. You waste your weapons. Celine's pulse hammered against her ribs. She couldn't read where this was going. The crowd seemed equally confused. One of the council members, a scarred alpha with silver braided through his beard, rose from his seat. My king, the prophecy is clear. An Omega with the moonborn mark will destroy me, yes. Kael's voice cut like a blade. I've read the scrolls, Gareth. I know the words. An Omega bearing 3 moons shall rise with power to shatter thrones and break the chains of those who rule through fear and blood. He paused, letting the words settle. Tell me, Gareth, do I rule through fear and blood? The question hung in the air like a knife. Gareth's jaw worked. You rule with strength, my king, as an alpha should. Strength. Kael repeated the word slowly, tasting it. Is that what we call it when we burn villages that won't submit? When we execute prisoners who won't swear loyalty? When we take children from conquered packs and raise them as weapons? The silence now was different, dangerous. You've done what was necessary, Gareth said carefully. To build an empire requires brutality, Kael finished. It requires making examples. It requires looking at a starved girl in chains and seeing only a threat to be eliminated. He turned back to Celine. Stand up. Celine's legs shook, but she forced herself upright. The torn shirt hung off one shoulder, barely decent. She was aware of thousands of eyes on her bare skin, on the mark that had defined her entire existence. Kael stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exact shade of gray in his eyes, like winter ice over deep water, close enough that she could smell leather and smoke and something darker underneath. And then she felt it. A pull. A recognition. Something that started in her chest and spread outward like heat through frozen limbs. No. Oh gods, no. Kael's pupils dilated. His hand rose as if of its own accord, stopping an inch from her face. She watched his control fracture in real time, the slight tremor in his fingers, the way his breathing changed rhythm. He felt it too. The mate bond. The biological imperative that turned alphas into desperate, possessive beasts. The thing that legend said could make kings abandon thrones and warriors forget oaths. Kael's hand clenched into a fist. He took a step back. Take her to the North Tower, he said, his voice carefully empty of inflection. Lock her in the chamber at the top. Post 6 guards. No one enters without my direct order. My king, Gareth started. Are you questioning my command? The temperature in the arena seemed to drop 10 degrees. No, my king. But the council believes I should kill a valuable asset because dead men wrote frightening poetry. Kael's gaze swept the seated advisors. This Omega will be held until I decide her fate. Anyone who acts against my orders will learn exactly how I deal with threats to my authority. And trust me. His smile was all edges. A chained healer is the least dangerous thing in this castle tonight. The guards grabbed Celine's arms. She didn't resist as they hauled her toward a side exit, but she looked back once, unable to help herself. Kael was watching her go. His expression was unreadable, but his hands were white-knuckled fists at his sides. The mate bond pulled tight between them, like a rope around drowning lungs. Ikik. The North Tower room was nothing like her cell in the Bloodfang pack. There was a bed, an actual bed with furs and pillows. A window that let in moonlight. A basin of clean water, and a table with bread and meat and fruit so fresh it still smelled of summer. Celine stood in the center of the room and shook. Not from cold. From the sheer impossibility of what had just happened. The Alpha King was her fated mate. The man who'd conquered half the realm through calculated violence. The king who'd built his empire on the bones of those who'd crossed him. The one person in the entire world who had every reason to want her dead. And instead of executing her, he'd locked her in a tower like she was something precious, or something too dangerous to let anyone else touch. Celine walked to the window and looked out over Shadowmoor Castle. The fortress sprawled below her like a city made of knives, all sharp angles and defensive walls, built to repel any assault. Torches burned in courtyard after courtyard. She could see guards patrolling the battlements, their movements precise and military. This was Kyle Draven's kingdom, a place where weakness meant death and mercy was a luxury no one could afford. And she was his mate. The thought should have terrified her. It did terrify her. But underneath the fear was something else, a traitorous curiosity. Because for just a moment in that arena when Kyle had looked at her, she'd seen something other than the ruthless king. She'd seen hunger, confusion. A desperate kind of loneliness that matched the echo in her own chest. The door lock rattled. Celine spun, heart racing. Kale stood in the doorway, alone. No guards, no counsel, no witnesses. He'd removed the fur from his shoulders, and she could see the full extent of his scars now. They ran down his neck and disappeared beneath his shirt. A map of violence survived. He closed the door behind him with careful precision. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You should eat," Kale finally said, nodding toward the table. "You're too thin. Are you going to kill me?" The question came out steady. Celine was proud of that. "I should." Kyle moved to the window, deliberately putting space between them. "The prophecy isn't wrong. You're dangerous." "I've never hurt anyone." "Not yet." He stared out at his kingdom. But power doesn't ask permission before it wakes up. And the kind of power in that mark, he stopped. The council has records, accounts from the last Moonborn Omega, 300 years ago. She leveled an entire city when her mate was killed. Every alpha within 10 miles just dropped dead. Hearts stopped. No warning. Celine's stomach turned. "I don't want that kind of power. What you want stopped mattering the moment you were born with those marks." Kale turned to face her. "I've spent 3 years building something. An empire, yes, but more than that. Structure, order. I united packs that had been at each other's throats for generations. I ended the constant wars. People can sleep without wondering if their neighbors will raid before dawn. You did it with fear. I did it with clarity." His voice hardened. "I showed every alpha in the realm what happens when you choose ambition over stability. I made the cost of rebellion so steep that peace became the only rational choice." "That's not peace, that's submission." "There's no difference." Kale took a step toward her. "Peace is what you call it when everyone's too afraid to fight. Everything else is just the quiet before blood." Celine held her ground. "Is that what you tell yourself? That the terror is necessary?" "It's not about what I tell myself." Another step. "It's about what works. I've executed 17 alphas since taking the throne. You know how many wars that prevented? 43. You know how many lives that saved? Thousands. And how many did you take?" "Exactly as many as I needed to." They were close now. Close enough that Celine could see gold flecks in Kyle's gray eyes. Close enough that the mate bond thrummed between them like a living wire. "You feel it," Kyle said quietly. It wasn't a question. "The pull." "Yes." "How strong?" Celine swallowed. Like drowning and breathing at the same time. Something shifted in Kyle's expression, a crack in the ice. "The last person who made me feel anything close to this was my sister. She was 12 when they killed her, slit her throat while she slept because she was the youngest and couldn't fight back. The confession hung between them. The rebellion," Celine said, 7 years ago. Led by alphas who wanted power, who thought a 16-year-old king would be easy to remove. Kale's voice went flat. "They murdered my father, my mother, my 2 brothers, my uncle. every member of my family except me, and only because I was hunting that night. I came back to a castle full of corpses. Kael Ukis. Don't. The word came out sharp. Don't sympathize. Don't look at me like I'm something to be healed. I killed every single one of them, tracked them to their territories, made them watch their families die first, burned their holdings to ash. And when it was done, I stood in the ruins and swore I'd never be weak enough to lose anything again. Celine understood then. The brutality wasn't random. It was a wall built from corpses, designed to keep grief at arm's length. And now, Kael continued, the fates, or the gods, or whatever controls this cursed world, decided to give me a mate. An Omega who's prophesied to destroy everything I've built. Tell me. His hand rose, hovering near her face again, but not touching. How am I supposed to reconcile that? How am I supposed to look at you and not see the end of everything I've bled for? Maybe that's exactly why, Selene said softly. Maybe you need to see the end before you become the very thing you swore to destroy. Kael's control shattered. He closed the distance between them and gripped her face with both hands. Not gentle, but not quite rough either, just desperate. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. I could kill you right now, he whispered. Snap your neck. Tell the council you attacked me. No one would question it. Then do it. Celine's pulse raced, but she didn't pull away. If I'm such a threat, if the prophecy terrifies you so much, end it. Stop talking about necessity and strength and just finish what you started in that arena. Kael's breathing was ragged. This close, she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of 3 years holding an empire together through sheer will and terror. I can't, he said finally. God's help me, I can't. He kissed her then. It wasn't soft or romantic or any of the things songs described. It was harsh and searching and tasted like desperation, like a drowning man grabbing for air, like someone who'd been alone so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to be touched without violence. Celine kissed him back, not because the bond demanded it, not because she was afraid, but because underneath the Killer King, underneath the scars and the calculated cruelty, she could taste the ghost of the boy who'd come home to a castle full of corpses. When they finally broke apart, Kael rested his forehead against hers. His hands were shaking. This doesn't change anything, he said. You're still dangerous. The prophecy is still real. I still have an empire to protect. I know. I'm going to keep you locked in this tower. I'm going to control who sees you. I'm going to watch every move you make. I know. And if you give me any reason to believe you're a threat, you'll do what you have to. Celine pulled back enough to meet his eyes. That's what kings do, right? Make the hard choices? Kael's laugh was bitter. You sound like my council. Your council wants me dead. So do I. He stopped. I can't want you and kill you at the same time. The bond won't let me, and that makes you the most dangerous thing I've ever faced. He stepped away, physically severing the connection. The mate bond pulled taut, a physical ache in Celine's chest. Get some sleep, Kael said, moving toward the door. Tomorrow I'll decide what to do with you. You already decided, Celine said. You just don't want to admit it. Kael paused with his hand on the door handle. And what's that? You're going to keep me alive. Because killing me means admitting the prophecy wins. And you've built your entire life on refusing to let anyone else dictate your choices. The silence stretched. You're clever, Kael said finally. That's going to make this harder. Good. You've had 3 years of easy brutality. Maybe hard is exactly what you need. Kael looked back at her one last time. In the moonlight streaming through the window, his scars seemed to glow silver. Be careful, Omega. The last person who challenged me ended up as a warning to others. I'm not challenging you, Celine said. I'm offering you a choice. What choice? Between the king you've become and the man you might still be. Kael left without answering. The lock clicked into place. Celine heard his footsteps retreat down the tower stairs. She walked to the bed and sat down heavily. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up. She'd just kissed the most feared king in the realm. She'd challenged him. She'd seen past his armor to the wound underneath, and she had absolutely no idea what came next. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance. The sound echoed off the castle walls and faded into night. Celine touched her lips, still tasting him. The prophecy said she would destroy his reign. But what if the prophecy was wrong about the method? What if the destruction wasn't violence but transformation? What if the way to shatter a throne built on fear was to make the king remember what it felt like to care about something other than survival? The question circled in her mind as exhaustion finally dragged her under. She fell asleep still wearing chains in a tower room that was both prison and sanctuary, bound to a king who wanted her dead and couldn't bear to let her go. Kael made it to his private chambers before the shaking started. He locked the door and braced his hands on the heavy oak table, breathing like he'd just fought for his life. What have I done? He should have killed her in the arena, clean, public, a message to everyone who believed prophecies could dictate reality. Instead, he'd claimed her as his mate in every way except words. He'd put her in a tower where he could control access. He'd kissed her like she was oxygen, and he'd been drowning for years. He'd made himself vulnerable. A knock on the door. Kael forced his breathing steady. "Come." Gareth entered, his expression carved from stone. "The council requests an audience, my king." "Let them request." "They're concerned about the Omega." "Their concern is noted and dismissed." Gareth closed the door behind him with deliberate care. "Kael, we've served together since you were 16. I've watched you build an empire from corpses and ash. I've never questioned your judgment. You're about to. She's your mate." Not a question. Gareth had been there the day Kael's father explained the mate bond, back when such things seemed like distant possibilities instead of immediate threats. "I saw your face in the arena." Kael straightened. "What you saw was strategy." "I saw a man who finally found something he couldn't control. And that terrifies you more than any prophecy." The truth of it hit like a blade between ribs. Kael turned to face his oldest advisor. "What would you have me do? Kill her and spend the rest of my life fighting the bond? Keep her alive and wait for the prophecy to come true?" "I would have you remember why you built this empire," Gareth said quietly. "It wasn't for power. It was because you lost everything and refused to let anyone else control your fate again." Exactly. And she offers you something every conqueror eventually faces. A reason to stop conquering. Gareth moved closer. "You've united the territories through fear. But fear is expensive, Kael. It requires constant maintenance, constant violence, constant vigilance. You're 23 and you look 40. How much longer can you sustain this?" "As long as necessary." "Until you're dead? Until the next rebellion succeeds where the first one failed? Or until you become so brutal that the empire collapses under its own weight?" Gareth shook his head. "The Omega could be your destruction, or she could be your evolution. But you can't have it both ways." Kael was silent for a long moment. "The council wants her dead. The council wants certainty, and right now you represent chaos. Since when is keeping a prisoner chaotic? Since that prisoner is your fated mate, and you can't decide whether to execute her or claim her." Gareth's voice softened. "I knew your father, Kael. I watched him build alliances. He would have said the mate bond is the gods giving you an opportunity. My father's alliances got him killed. Your father's mercy got him killed. There's a difference between alliance and weakness." Gareth moved toward the door. "The Omega healed 17 warriors before her pack locked her away. Imagine what she could do if you aimed her at your enemies instead of treating her like a threat." He left before Kael could respond. Alone again, Kyle walked to the window. He could see the North Tower from here, a dark spire against the night sky. One window glowed with lamplight. Celine was up there, probably scared, definitely confused, completely unaware that she'd just upended 3 years of careful control. The mate bond pulled tight. Kael could feel her even from this distance, a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with recognition. He'd spent 3 years making sure nothing could hurt him. He'd eliminated threats. He'd built walls. He'd turned himself into something too dangerous to grieve. And in one moment, one impossible connection, all of it crumbled. Kael pressed his palm against the cold stone wall. Somewhere below, the castle continued its nightly rhythms. Guards changed shifts. Servants cleaned halls. The empire he'd built turned like clockwork, each piece in its place. But empires were fragile things. His father had taught him that. Built from trust and shattered by ambition. Held together by hope and torn apart by greed. Kale had rebuilt using fear instead. But fear was just another word for control through pain. And control required constant enforcement. And enforcement required brutality. And brutality required forgetting what it felt like to be human. He'd succeeded. For 3 years, he'd succeeded. And then Celine Vale looked at him with eyes that saw past the scars to the wound underneath. "You're going to keep me alive," she'd said, "because killing me means admitting the prophecy wins." Clever. Too clever. She'd read him like he was written in her own language. But she was wrong about one thing. It wasn't about refusing to let the prophecy dictate his choices. It was simpler and more damning than that. He couldn't kill her because the moment he'd felt the mate bond snap into place, he'd recognized something he thought died 7 years ago. Hope. Not for the Empire, not for peace or alliance or any of the strategic benefits Gareth mentioned. Hope that maybe, possibly, he didn't have to be alone anymore. And that hope was the most dangerous thing in the world. Kael turned from the window. Tomorrow he'd meet with the council. Tomorrow he'd begin the delicate work of explaining why the prophesied threat was now under his protection. Tomorrow he'd start building whatever came next. But tonight, just for tonight, he let himself feel the warmth of the bond in his chest and remember what it was like to want something other than revenge. 3 floors below, in a chamber filled with maps and strategic documents, the council gathered in secret. Gareth was notably absent. 6 alphas sat in a circle, their faces grave in the lamplight. At the head of the table sat Magnus Crowthorne, eldest of the council and the man who'd served Kael's father before him. "The king has made his choice," Magnus said. "The Omega lives." "Then we have a problem," said Vera Ashbourne, the only female alpha on the council. Her scars told the story of decades spent in combat. "The prophecy is clear. An Omega with the Moonborn mark will destroy his reign. We cannot allow sentiment to compromise the stability we've fought for." "The king isn't sentimental," argued Thorne Blackwater. "He's strategic. Perhaps he sees value in keeping her alive." "He sees a mate," Magnus said quietly. "I watched his face in the arena. The bond has claimed him." Silence fell over the table. "Then we act," Vera said. "For the good of the realm." "You're proposing treason." Thorne's voice was careful. "I'm proposing prevention." Vera leaned forward. Kael Draven is a brilliant king. He united territories that had been at war for generations. But the mate bond makes even the strongest alpha vulnerable. If the prophecy is true, and 300 years of records suggest it is, then keeping that Omega alive is a death sentence for everything we've built. "What are you suggesting?" asked Corbin Ironfang, youngest of the council but no less brutal for his age. Magnus pulled a small vial from his robes. Dark liquid sloshed inside. Nightshade. Concentrated. Enough to stop a heart in minutes. "You want to poison her?" Thorne looked sick. "I want to save the Empire," Magnus said. "The king cannot make this choice. The bond won't let him, so we make it for him." "And when he discovers what we've done?" Corbin asked. "He'll be furious," Vera admitted. "He may execute one or all of us, but he'll be alive, and the Empire will be intact. Our lives for thousands of others? That's a trade I'll make." Around the table, heads nodded slowly, reluctant agreement settling like snow. "It has to be clean," Magnus said. "No suspicion. The Omega is weak from years of starvation. A sudden illness wouldn't be questioned." "The guards?" Thorne asked. "I'll handle them." Vera's smile was grim. "Gold buys loyalty when fear doesn't reach." "When?" Corbin's voice was barely a whisper. Magnus set the vial in the center of the table. "Tomorrow night, during the blood moon. We'll call it divine timing, the prophecy prevented by the very forces that created it." The council sat in silence, each alpha weighing treason against preservation. Finally, Magnus spoke again. "All in favor?" 5 hands rose. The decision was made. In the North Tower, Celine woke suddenly from a dreamless sleep. Her heart pounded for no reason she could name. The room was dark except for moonlight streaming through the window. She sat up, chains rattling. The mate bond pulled tight in her chest, not painful, but insistent, like a warning from somewhere deep in her instincts. Somewhere in the castle, Kael was awake too. She could feel it. And somewhere else, in chambers she'd never seen, 6 alphas were planning her death. The pieces were in motion. The prophecy was waking up. And Selene Vale, the Omega who'd spent 22 years being told she was worthless, was about to discover that some curses don't destroy you. They set you free. Dawn came to Shadowmoor Castle like a blade, sharp, cold, inevitable. Selene woke to the sound of boots on stone and realized the guards were changing shifts outside her door. 6 of them, Kael had said. 6 alphas, whose only job was to make sure she stayed exactly where he'd put her. She sat up slowly, chains clinking. Her body ached from sleeping in restraints, but that was nothing new. 22 years in the Blood Fang pack had taught her how to find rest in uncomfortable places. What was new, what made her chest tight and her pulse unsteady, was the warmth that bloomed somewhere behind her ribs every time she thought about the king who'd kissed her like drowning. The mate bond hummed constant now. Not painful, just present, like having another heartbeat running parallel to her own. Selene walked to the window and looked out over the castle grounds. From this height, she could see everything. Courtyards where warriors trained with swords and spears, stables housing horses bred for war, gardens that looked more like strategic positions than decoration. Every inch of Shadowmoor was built for one purpose, to withstand assault and Project Power, just like the man who ruled it. A knock on the door made her turn, not the heavy thud of a guard's fist, something more careful. The lock clicked. The door opened. A woman entered carrying a tray of food, older, maybe 50, with gray threading through dark hair pulled back severe. Her eyes swept Selene once, taking inventory. "I'm Maven," she said, setting the tray on the table. "Head of household staff." The king ordered breakfast delivered. Selene didn't move toward the food. "Did he order you to poison it too?" Maven's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "If the king wanted you dead, you'd already be corpse. He doesn't need poison when he's got perfectly good hands." She gestured at the tray. "It's bread, cheese, dried fruit, and water. I watched Cook make it myself." "Why would you do that?" "Because the king gave an order, and because—" Maven paused, studying Selene with sharper attention. "Because you're the first thing in 3 years that's made him look like something other than a walking weapon." Selene moved closer to the table but didn't sit. "You knew him before." "I knew his mother. Served her for 20 years before they killed her." Maven's voice went flat in the way that meant old grief had calcified into something harder. "She was a good woman. Fair. Kind when she could afford to be. The king has her eyes. But not her kindness. Kindness gets you murdered in your sleep." Maven began straightening things that didn't need straightening, the kind of nervous movement that came from discussing dangerous topics. After the rebellion, Kael had a choice: become brutal enough that no one would dare try again, or die waiting for the next assassination attempt. He chose survival. He chose fear. Same thing in this world. Maven met her eyes directly. "You think you're going to fix him? Make him soft again? Turn the monster back into a man?" Selene considered the question carefully. "I think maybe he's been both all along. He just forgot which one he wanted to be." Maven studied her for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She smiled. Real warmth, not the professional courtesy of a servant. "You're either very brave or very stupid. I haven't decided which." "Can it be both?" "With you?" "Probably." Maven moved toward the door, then stopped. "A word of advice, Omega. The council meets this morning to discuss your fate. They're not pleased the king kept you alive. Whatever happens next, don't assume anyone in this castle is your friend, including me." "Then why warn me?" "Because the queen would have wanted someone to." Maven's hand was on the door handle. "And because I'm tired of watching good people get swallowed by this place." She left. The lock clicked back into place. Selene sat down and forced herself to eat. The food was good, better than anything she'd tasted in years. Each bite felt like betrayal. Her pack would still be eating scraps and yesterday's meat while she sat in a tower eating fresh bread, except they weren't her pack. They'd made that clear every day of her life. She was halfway through the meal when she felt it, a sharp pull in her chest, like someone had hooked the mate bond and yanked. Kael was coming. Celine barely had time to stand before the door opened again. No knock this time. Kale strode in like he owned every inch of space, which technically he did. He'd changed clothes since last night, black leather and dark wool that made him look even more like the weapon Maven had described. But his eyes. Gods, his eyes were exhausted. Did you sleep? Celine asked before she could stop herself. Kael's expression flickered. Surprise, maybe annoyance that she'd noticed. Sleep is a luxury for people who don't have empires to maintain. Sleep is a necessity for people who want to stay alive. I've been doing fine for 3 years. You look 40. The words were out before Celine could think better of them. She braced for anger. Instead, Kael laughed, a short, bitter sound that held no humor. My advisor said the same thing last night. He moved to the window, deliberately putting distance between them. The mate bond stretched taut. The council wants you dead. I'm meeting with them in an hour to explain why you're still breathing. What are you going to tell them? That you're valuable. That a healer who can resurrect the dying is worth more alive than executed. He turned to face her. That killing you because of a prophecy is exactly the kind of fear-based decision I've spent 3 years eliminating. And the part where I'm your mate? Kael's jaw tightened. That's not their concern. It will be when they figure it out. Alphas can smell a bond. Let them smell. I don't justify my decisions to anyone. But his hands clenched into fists at his sides, betraying the words. Celine took a step closer. The bond pulled like gravity. You're terrified. Excuse me? Not of the council, not of the prophecy, of this. She gestured between them. Of feeling something you can't control with violence or strategy. Kael closed the distance so fast Celine barely tracked the movement. He didn't touch her, but he stood close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him, could smell leather and smoke and something underneath that was just him. You don't know anything about me, he said quietly. Dangerous. I know you've built a throne on corpses and convinced yourself it was necessary. I know you haven't let anyone close enough to matter in 7 years. I know the mate bond is the first thing you've felt that you can't just kill and move past. Celine held his gaze. And I know you came here this morning because you wanted to see me, not because you needed to discuss council strategy. For a moment, Kael's control cracked completely. She saw it in his eyes, hunger and fury and desperation all tangled together. His hand rose, fingers ghosting along her jaw, not quite touching. I could have you executed for speaking to me like this, he whispered. You won't. You're very confident for someone in chains. I'm confident because you've had a dozen chances to kill me and you keep choosing conversation instead. Celine's pulse hammered, but she didn't back down. That's not strategy, Kael. That's hope. And it's eating you alive. Kael's hand dropped. He stepped back like she'd burned him. The council meeting is in an hour. I'll return afterward to inform you of their decision. Will there be a decision, or have you already made it for them? I'm a king, not a tyrant. The council has a voice. The council has the illusion of a voice. You've executed every alpha who seriously challenged you. They know the cost of disagreement. Then they should know better than to question me on this. Celine watched him move toward the door. What happens if they demand my execution anyway? If they push hard enough that refusing means looking weak? Kael stopped, didn't turn around. Then I'll show them exactly what weakness looks like when I'm finished with them. He left before she could respond. The lock clicked. Celine stood in the sudden silence and tried to steady her breathing. She'd pushed him, deliberately, recklessly, and he'd let her. That meant something. She just wasn't sure if it meant progress, or if she was baiting a wolf that would eventually remember it had teeth. Outside her window, the sun climbed higher. Somewhere below, the council was gathering. 6 alphas who'd served Kael's father and now served Kael. 6 voices that carried weight, even if the final decision was never really theirs. And somewhere in that council, Celine knew without being told, were wolves who'd already decided she needed to die. The council chamber was built like everything else in Shadowmoor. Functional, defensive, designed to remind everyone who held power. Stone walls. Heavy table. Chairs positioned so no one could be surprised from behind. Windows placed high enough that you couldn't see out but light still filtered in. Kael sat at the head of the table and waited for his council to settle. Gareth was to his right, solid and calm as always. The others, Magnus, Vera, Thorn, Corbin, and Lysa, took their positions with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this hundreds of times. Magnus spoke first. He always did. Eldest of the council, gray beard braided with silver, eyes that had seen empires rise and collapse. My king, we gather to discuss the matter of the Omega. There's nothing to discuss, Kael said. I've made my decision. She lives. We understand you see strategic value, Vera began. I see more than strategic value. I see the first healer in 3 generations who can resurrect the dying. I see a weapon that every other alpha would kill to possess. And I see an opportunity to prove that this empire doesn't make decisions based on fear of prophecies spoken by corpses. Thorn leaned forward. The prophecy has historical precedent, my king. 300 years ago, 300 years ago, an Omega destroyed a city after her mate was murdered. I'm aware. Kael's voice could have cut glass. I'm also aware that her power only manifested during extreme emotional trauma. Keep her stable, keep her protected, and the prophecy stays dormant. You're gambling the Empire on keep her stable, Magnus said quietly. I'm gambling the Empire on my ability to control assets, something I've proven rather adept at. Kael let his gaze sweep the table. Unless you've all suddenly developed amnesia about the last 3 years. Silence. The kind that meant everyone wanted to speak, but no one wanted to be first. Finally, Lysa, youngest of the council, appointed after proving herself in border conflicts, broke it. What about the mate bond? The room went very still. Kael looked at her directly. What about it? We're not blind, my king. We saw your face in the arena. We know what a bond looks like when it snaps into place. Lysa's voice was careful but firm. The question isn't whether you feel it. The question is whether you can rule while feeling it. I've ruled through worse. Grief and rage are different from attachment, Gareth said quietly. One motivates revenge, the other creates vulnerability. Are you questioning my capability? I'm questioning whether any alpha can maintain objectivity when their mate is involved. Gareth met his eyes steadily. Your father loved your mother deeply. It made him merciful to her enemies. That mercy got them both killed. Kael's hands went white-knuckled on the armrests. I am not my father. No, you're harder, colder, more willing to make brutal choices. Gareth paused. But the bond doesn't care about any of that. It only cares about keeping her alive. And the prophecy says she'll destroy your reign. The prophecy says an Omega with the Moonborn mark will shatter thrones built on fear and blood. Perhaps the solution is to stop building on fear and blood. The words fell like stones into water. Magnus recovered first. You're suggesting we change our entire approach to governance because of one Omega? I'm suggesting we consider evolution instead of stagnation. Fear works until it doesn't. Eventually, people become more afraid of living under tyranny than dying in rebellion. We're already seeing fractures, border disputes, raids, packs testing our response time. How long before fear stops being enough? Vera shook her head. With respect, my king, the moment you show weakness, every alpha in the realm will see an opening. Who said anything about weakness? Kael stood. When he moved, it was with the predatory grace that made people remember he'd earned his crown in blood. I'm suggesting we expand our methods. Fear remains, but we add incentive, loyalty through benefit instead of just terror through consequence. And the Omega facilitates this how? Corbin asked. She heals. Publicly. Warriors who serve loyally get access to a healer who can bring them back from the edge of death. That's a benefit no other territory can offer. That's loyalty bought with something other than fear of execution. The council exchanged glances. Kael could see the calculation happening, weighing risk against potential gain, personal safety against imperial stability. It's unprecedented, Magnus said slowly. So was uniting 12 territories in 3 years. So was ending the constant border wars. So was building an empire from the corpse of a failed rebellion. Kael placed both hands flat on the table. I don't need your permission. I'm king, but I'm giving you the courtesy of explanation before I proceed. That courtesy has limits. The threat was implicit and clear. Thorn cleared his throat. If the council were to support this approach, we'd need safeguards. The Omega would need to be monitored. Any sign of instability or power manifestation would require immediate action. Agreed. She remains in the North Tower. 6 guards. I personally oversee any use of her healing abilities. Kale's gaze swept the table again. Anything else? More silence. Then one by one, heads nodded. Reluctant acceptance settling over the room like dust. All except Magnus. The old alpha sat very still, his expression unreadable. Magnus? Kale prompted. I support my king's decision, Magnus said carefully. I only hope we're not building our own destruction. If we are, I'll handle it myself. Kale moved toward the door. Meeting dismissed. Gareth, remain. The council filed out in silence. When the door closed behind them, Kale turned to his oldest advisor. They're going to move against her, Kale said flatly. Magnus especially. I saw it in his eyes. I saw it too. Gareth stood slowly. The question is whether they'll move against you as well. If they try, they'll discover exactly how permanent execution can be. And if they succeed, if they poison her or stage an accident before you can prevent it? Gareth moved closer. The mate bond will drive you mad, KL. You'll tear the Empire apart looking for revenge. Then they'd better make sure they kill me too. Gareth was quiet for a long moment. You love her. I don't know her. The bond doesn't need time to create attachment, it just needs recognition. Gareth's voice softened. Your father always said the mate bond was the gods giving you a partner, someone to share the weight. My father died because he trusted his partner's judgment over his own instincts. Your father died because he was betrayed by alphas who valued power over loyalty. Don't confuse the two. Gareth headed for the door, then paused. Maven tells me the Omega challenged you this morning, called you out on your fear. Maven talks too much. Maven sees what the rest of us miss because we're too busy being terrified of you. Gareth smiled slightly. The Omega might be the best thing that's happened to this empire, or she might be its end. Either way, pretending she's just a strategic asset is going to destroy you faster than any prophecy. He left. Kale stood alone in the council chamber and felt the mate bond pull tight in his chest. Celine was awake, probably pacing, definitely worried about what the council had decided. She'd challenged him this morning, called him terrified, seen straight through the armor to the wound underneath. And she was right. Kale wasn't afraid of assassination attempts, or rebellion, or even the prophecy itself. He was afraid of wanting something so badly that losing it would break him. He was afraid of becoming his father, too merciful, too trusting, too willing to believe love could coexist with power. But he was also afraid of becoming nothing but the weapon his empire needed, of looking in a mirror one day and seeing only scar tissue where a man used to be. Celine offered something he'd thought was impossible, not just a mate, a choice, between the king he'd become and the man he might still be. The question was whether he had the courage to choose. Maven returned to the North Tower just after midday. She carried a bundle of clothes, simple wool dress, thick stockings, actual shoes instead of the rags Celine had arrived in. The king wants you presentable, Maven said, setting the bundle on the bed. You're being moved to better quarters. Celine looked up from the window where she'd been watching the sun track across the sky. He's keeping me alive. For now. The council agreed to a probationary period. You heal warriors under supervision, prove you're valuable, and maybe you get to keep breathing long term. Maven's expression was carefully neutral. Or you do something that triggers the prophecy, and you're dead before you can finish screaming. Sounds fair. Fair has nothing to do with it. This is survival. Maven gestured at the clothes. Get dressed. The king is moving you in an hour. Moving me where? Chambers adjacent to his own, where he can monitor you directly. Celine's pulse jumped. That's unprecedented, yes. Also strategic. Puts you under his personal protection, makes it clear to everyone in the castle that you're his asset, not council property. Maven's eyes narrowed. You understand what that means? You're not just a prisoner anymore. You're his responsibility, his possession. Every decision you make reflects on him. I'm not anyone's possession. Maven laughed, sharp and bitter. You're an Omega with a mate bond to the most powerful alpha in the realm. You stopped being your own person the moment that connection snapped into place. She moved toward the door. Get dressed, learn to navigate this world, or die fighting against reality. Your choice. She left. Celine stared at the clothes on the bed. His possession. The words sat like stones in her stomach. 22 years in the Bloodfang pack had taught her what it meant to be property, something used and discarded, valued only for utility, locked away when inconvenient. But this was different. Kale didn't see her as property. He saw her as threat and salvation tangled together. He saw her as the one thing his control couldn't quite contain, and that made her dangerous. Celine stripped off her rags and pulled on the new clothes. The wool was soft, well made. The dress fit almost perfectly. Someone had taken measurements, probably while she slept. The thought should have been invasive. Instead, it felt like being seen. She was lacing the shoes when the door opened. No knock, no warning. Just Kyle filling the doorway like he was carved from the same stone as his castle. His eyes tracked over her once. Quick inventory. Nothing predatory about it. Better, he said. You look less like something I dragged out of a dungeon. Is that a compliment? It's an observation. Compliments are earned. And what do I have to do to earn one from you? Kale's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Survive the next week without triggering a civil war. That would be a start. He gestured toward the door. Come on, I'm moving you before the evening shift change. Fewer witnesses. Celine followed him into the corridor. The 6 guards fell into formation around them, 3 ahead, 3 behind. They moved through the castle like a military operation, every step calculated. The halls were quieter than Celine expected. Most of the household staff seemed to have vanished. Deliberate, she realized. Kale had cleared the route. They climbed 2 flights of stairs and turned down a corridor that was noticeably different from the tower. Wider, better lit. Tapestries on the walls depicting battles and conquests. These were the royal quarters. Kale stopped at a door and produced a key. Your new prison, he said, pushing it open. Celine stepped inside and stopped. Calling this a prison was like calling a wolf a dog. Technically accurate, but missing essential context. The room was huge. A bed large enough for 3 people draped in furs. A fireplace already lit, heat pushing back the castle's permanent chill. Windows with actual glass, not just shutters. A desk. Shelves lined with books. A bathing chamber visible through an open doorway. This is... Celine couldn't finish the sentence. Excessive? Probably. But the council is watching. If I'm claiming you as a valuable asset, I need to treat you like one. Kale moved to the fireplace, using the moment to avoid her eyes. My chambers are through that door, connected. I'll hear if anything happens. You mean you'll hear if I try to escape? That too. He turned to face her. The rules are simple. You don't leave this room without my direct supervision. You speak to no one without my permission. You use your healing abilities only when I authorize it. Break any of these rules and the council's probation ends immediately. So I went from one cell to a nicer cell. You went from guaranteed execution to provisional survival. Learn the difference. Celine moved closer. The mate bond hummed between them, stronger in proximity. Why are you doing this? And don't tell me it's strategy. You could have kept me in the tower and achieved the same political outcome. Kale was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rougher. Because you're right. About the fear. About building thrones on corpses. About becoming nothing but the weapon the Empire needs. He met her eyes. And because when I look at you, I remember what it felt like to want something other than revenge. The confession hung in the air between them. Celine took another step, close enough now that she could see the exhaustion in the fine lines around his eyes. Close enough that the bond pulled like a rope around her ribs. What do you want? She asked quietly. Things I can't have. Things that would make me weak. Or things that would make you human. Kael's hand rose, cupping her face with a gentleness that contradicted everything she knew about him. His thumb traced her cheekbone. Being human got my family killed. Being a weapon kept me alive. And being alone, Celine's voice was barely a whisper. What did that get you? 3 years of peace, an empire, respect through fear. Sounds lonely. Lonely doesn't kill you, attachment does. But even as he said it, Kael leaned closer. His forehead touched hers. The bond sang between them, recognition and hunger and something deeper that neither of them had words for. This is a mistake, Kael breathed. Probably. The council is looking for any excuse to eliminate you. I know. And I can't, his voice cracked. I can't lose anything else. I barely survived it the first time. Celine's hands came up to rest on his chest. She could feel his heartbeat through the leather, fast, unsteady. Then don't lose me. Protect me. Let me be something other than a threat. You are a threat. The prophecy. The prophecy says I'll destroy your reign. Maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. Maybe the reign built on fear needs to end so something better can begin. Kael pulled back just enough to look at her. His eyes were storm gray, turbulent. You want me to tear down everything I've built? I want you to evolve it, keep the strength, lose the cruelty. Build something that lasts because people choose it, not because they're too terrified to resist. That's not how empires work. Then maybe we build something better than an empire. The door burst open. Gareth stood in the threshold, breathing hard. My king, we have a problem. Kael stepped away from Celine instantly, controls slamming back into place. Report. Border scouts just arrived. The Ironwood pack is mobilizing. 300 warriors, maybe more. They're claiming you've been compromised by the Omega. They're calling for your removal. Silence crashed over the room. Kael's expression went flat, empty, the weapon sliding back into place. How long until they reach our borders? 2 days, maybe 3 if the weather turns. Send word to our garrison commanders. Full mobilization. I want every warrior ready to march by dawn. Kael's voice could have been carved from ice. And send a message to the Ironwood Alpha. Tell him if he wants my throne, he's welcome to try taking it. I'll personally hand him his spine as a souvenir. Gareth nodded and vanished. Kael turned back to Celine. The man who'd touched her face with gentleness was gone. The Alpha King stood in his place. Stay in this room, he said. Lock the door from the inside. Let no one in but me or Maven. Do you understand? Kael, do you understand? The command in his voice was absolute. Yes. He moved to the connecting door to his chambers, then stopped. Didn't turn around. The Ironwood pack is using you as justification for war. They're betting I'll choose you over the Empire. They're betting the mate bond makes me weak. What are you going to do? Prove them wrong. He looked back at her then. And hope I don't destroy us both in the process. He left. The door closed. Celine heard the lock click from the other side. She stood alone in her gilded prison and felt the mate bond stretch thin as Kael moved deeper into the castle, preparing for war, choosing between the Omega he'd claimed and the empire he'd built. Outside her window, the sun began its descent toward evening. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, 300 warriors were marching toward Shadowmoor, and somewhere in the castle's shadows, 6 council members were adjusting their plans. Because if the king was distracted by war, there had never been a better time to eliminate a prophesied threat. The pieces were in motion. The betrayal was coming. And Celine Vale, locked in royal chambers while armies prepared for battle, was about to discover that some prophecies don't give you a choice. They just force you to become what you were always meant to be. The first sign came 3 hours after Kael left for the War Council. Celine was pacing her gilded cage when the mate bond went sharp in her chest. Not painful exactly, but wrong. Like a string pulled too tight, vibrating with tension that shouldn't be there. She pressed her hand against her ribs and felt Kael somewhere in the castle depths, his emotions bleeding through the connection. Rage, calculation, the cold focus of a predator preparing to kill. He was getting ready for war. Real war, not the political maneuvering that passed for conflict in council chambers. 300 Ironwood warriors were marching toward Shadowmoor, and Kael was going to meet them with everything he had. Because of her. Because the mate bond made him look compromised. Because she existed. Celine moved to the window and watched the sun sink lower. The castle courtyard below had transformed into organized chaos. Warriors assembling in formation, blacksmiths working overtime on weapons, supply wagons being loaded with provisions for a campaign. Every piece moving with military precision, like watching a machine built for one purpose. Destruction. She wondered if Kael saw the irony. He'd spent 3 years building an empire designed to prevent exactly this kind of conflict. And now that empire was mobilizing for war because its king had chosen to keep one cursed Omega alive. A knock on the door made her turn. Not the heavy thud of guards. Something lighter. Almost cautious. Celine moved to the door but didn't open it. Who is it? Maven, I have dinner. A pause. An information the king would want you to have. Celine unlocked the door slowly. Maven stood in the corridor holding a tray, her expression carefully neutral. But her eyes were sharp with warning. Maven entered quickly and closed the door behind her. She set the tray down and turned to face Celine directly. The council is meeting tonight, Maven said quietly. Without the king. He's in the strategy chamber planning the Ironwood campaign, and they're using the distraction. Meeting about what? About you. About the prophecy. About whether the Empire can survive a king who puts his mate above stability. Maven's voice dropped even lower. I heard Magnus talking to Vera in the kitchens. They think Kael is compromised. They think removing you is the only way to save him from himself. Celine's stomach turned. He told them I'm under his protection, that moving against me means moving against him, and they're betting he won't find out until it's too late, or that he'll be forced to choose between you and the Empire, and they know which choice a king has to make. Maven moved closer. There's something else. The night guard rotation has been changed. Instead of 6 guards outside your door, there will be 2, both loyal to Magnus. That's not protection. That's access. Exactly. Maven's hand went to her apron pocket and produced a small vial. Dark liquid sloshed inside. I found this in the council pantry, nightshade, concentrated enough to stop a heart in minutes. The room seemed to tilt. Celine stared at the vial and felt the walls closing in. They're going to poison me. Tonight, during the blood moon ceremony, half the castle will be in the courtyard for the ritual. Perfect cover, a tragic accident. The cursed Omega's heart just gave out. These things happen to the weak. And Kael will be leading the blood oath with his warriors. By the time he finishes and returns to check on you, you'll be cold. Maven's expression was grim. They're counting on the mate bond driving him to rage instead of investigation. A grief-mad king is easier to control than a calculating one. Celine moved to the window, her mind racing. Below, warriors were gathering in the main courtyard. She could see torches being lit in preparation for the ceremony, an ancient ritual where alphas swore loyalty and blood before marching to war. Kael would be at the center of it, binding his forces together with oaths that couldn't be broken. He'd be completely occupied, completely vulnerable to what his own council was planning in the shadows. Why are you telling me this? Celine asked without turning around. Because the queen would have done the same. And because I'm tired of watching good people get swallowed by necessary evils. Maven set the vial on the table. You have a choice, Omega. You can wait here and let them poison you, or you can do something about it. What can I do? I'm locked in a room with 2 guards outside who answer to the people trying to kill me. You're locked in a room connected to the king's personal chambers, chambers that have a private exit leading directly to the strategy wing. Maven pulled a key from her pocket and pressed it into Celine's hand. The council meets in the East Tower. If you can get there before they finalize their plan, if you can prove to Kael what they're doing, he'll execute them, his entire council, right before marching to war. Celine shook her head. That would destabilize everything. And letting them kill you stabilizes what exactly? A king driven mad by a broken mate bond? An empire ruled by alphas who think murder is acceptable policy? Maven's voice hardened. The queen used to say that sometimes the only way to save a kingdom is to force its king to see what he's become. Maybe that's your role in this prophecy. Not destruction through power, destruction through truth. Celine looked at the key in her palm. Small. Ordinary. The kind of object that shouldn't hold the weight of empires. But Maven was right. Sitting here waiting to be poisoned wasn't survival. It was surrender. And Celine had spent 22 years surrendering to people who saw her as expendable. She was done being the sacrifice everyone expected. If I do this, Celine said slowly, if I go to Kael during the blood oath ceremony and expose the council, you'll shatter whatever illusion he has left about ruling through fear and loyalty. You'll force him to choose between the advisors who helped him build his empire and the mate he barely knows. Maven moved toward the door. But at least you'll be alive to see what choice he makes. She left. The lock clicked. Celine stood holding the key and feeling the mate bond pull tight in her chest. Kael was in the strategy chamber right now, planning a war he didn't want to fight, preparing to lead warriors into battle because his enemies thought the mate bond made him weak. He was doing exactly what he'd always done, choosing the Empire over everything else. But the Empire he was trying to save was rotting from the inside. His own council was planning treason. The alphas he'd trusted to help him rebuild were the same ones sharpening knives in the dark. And he had no idea. Celine moved to the connecting door and inserted the key. It turned smoothly. The door opened onto Kael's personal chambers, darker than hers, more Spartan. A bed that looked barely used, weapons mounted on the walls, maps spread across a desk, marked with strategic positions and supply routes. This was where the Alpha King slept, if he slept at all. Celine crossed the room quickly and found the private exit Maven had mentioned, a narrow door concealed behind a tapestry. It opened onto a servant's corridor, dimly lit and empty. Everyone was preparing for the ceremony. She stepped into the corridor and started moving. No guards here. No witnesses. Just stone walls and flickering torches and the sound of her own breathing too loud in the silence. The strategy wing was 2 floors down and across the castle's main spine. Celine moved as fast as she dared, staying to the shadows, using her knowledge of how servants moved through spaces the nobility never noticed. She'd spent her whole life being invisible. Now it might be the only thing keeping her alive. She was halfway across a junction when she heard voices, male, multiple. Coming closer, Celine pressed herself into an alcove and held her breath. 2 warriors passed within feet of her, talking in low voices about formations and supply lines. They didn't even glance in her direction. She waited until their footsteps faded, then kept moving. The strategy wing was guarded, but Maven had been right. Everyone was distracted by ceremony preparations. Celine slipped past the main checkpoint by using a storage passage that connected to the lower levels. She emerged in a corridor lined with maps and tactical displays. The strategy chamber door was closed, but she could hear voices inside. Kael's voice, deep and authoritative, discussing troop movements and defensive positions. Other voices responding. His generals, his war council, the people he trusted to help him keep the empire intact. Celine's hand went to the door handle. One turn and she'd interrupt the entire planning session. One moment and she'd tell Kael that his personal counsel was planning to murder his mate while he swore blood oaths in the courtyard. She'd force him to choose, right now, right here. With war approaching and loyalty fracturing and no good options available. The door opened before she could decide. Gareth stood in the threshold, his expression shifting from surprise to understanding in the space of a heartbeat. He stepped into the corridor and closed the door behind him. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "The council is planning to kill me tonight, during the blood moon ceremony. They have nightshade. They've changed the guard rotation to give themselves access." The words came out in a rush. "Maven found the poison. She told me to warn Kael before they succeed." Gareth's voice was flat. "Yes, I know." Celine's blood went cold. "You know?" "I've known since last night. Magnus approached me after the council meeting, asked if I'd support removing the Omega for the good of the realm." Gareth met her eyes steadily. "I told him I'd consider it." The betrayal hit like a physical blow. Gareth was Kael's oldest advisor, the one person who'd served since before the rebellion, the one voice Kael actually listened to. "Why?" Celine's voice cracked. "You told him to consider me as an asset. You said the mate bond could be his evolution." "I said those things because I needed to buy time to understand what you actually are." Gareth took a step closer. "And now I know. You're not just a healer. You're not just a prophesied threat. You're the thing that will make him choose between the man he was and the king he became, and that choice will destroy him. Or save him. There's no difference. The moment Kael starts making decisions based on love instead of strategy, the empire fractures. Every alpha who's submitted to his authority will see weakness. The Ironwood Pack is just the beginning. Within a year, we'll be back to constant territorial wars and blood feuds." Gareth's expression was carved from granite. "I watched Kael's father make the same choice. Mercy over strength, love over fear. It got his entire family slaughtered. So you'd rather kill me and let Kael become a monster?" "I'd rather preserve the empire we built from ashes. The empire that's given people 3 years of stability. 3 years without wondering if their neighbors will raid before dawn. 3 years of actual peace." Gareth's voice hardened. "Your life against thousands of others. It's not a difficult calculation." Celine understood then. This wasn't about prophecy. This wasn't even about the mate bond. This was about men who'd seen empires collapse and would do anything, betray anyone, to prevent it from happening again. Kael won't forgive this, she said quietly. When he finds out you knew, he won't find out. You'll die tonight. Tragic accident. I'll help him through the grief. We'll march to war and crush the Ironwood Rebellion, and the Empire will survive. Gareth moved his hand toward his belt, and Celine saw the knife. I'm sorry, truly. But this is bigger than you, bigger than his feelings, bigger than One Omega's life. He moved fast, but Celine had grown up dodging violence. She twisted away from his first grab and ran. The corridor exploded into chaos. Gareth shouted for guards. Doors slammed open. Warriors poured into the hallway, and Celine ran blind, her only thought to reach Kael before Gareth's knife found her spine. She burst through a side door and found herself in the main gallery overlooking the courtyard. Below, hundreds of warriors had gathered for the Blood Moon ceremony. Torches burned in perfect circles. At the center of it all stood Kael, dressed in ceremonial armor, his face painted with ash and blood in the old tradition. He was raising a blade to begin the oath when Celine screamed his name. Every head turned. Every eye locked on the Omega standing in the gallery, breathing hard, terror written across her face. Kael's expression shifted from confusion to fury in a heartbeat. He moved toward the gallery stairs like a storm incarnate, warriors scattering from his path. Gareth caught up to Celine before she could run again. His hand closed around her arm, grip bruising. Don't, he hissed. Don't make this worse. But Kael was already there. He took the stairs 3 at a time and emerged into the gallery, like violence given form. His eyes tracked from Celine to Gareth's hand on her arm to the knife still visible at his advisor's belt. Explain, Kael said. One word. Absolute command. She escaped her chambers, my king. I was returning her. He knew. Celine's voice cut through the lie. The council is planning to poison me tonight. Magnus has Nightshade. They changed the guard rotation to give themselves access, and Gareth knew. He admitted it before he tried to kill me himself. The silence that followed was the kind that preceded avalanches. Kael looked at Gareth, really looked. And Celine watched something die in the king's eyes, the last thread of trust he'd been holding on to. Tell me she's lying, Kael said quietly. Dangerous. Gareth met his gaze steadily. I can't, because she's not. The courtyard below had gone completely still. Hundreds of warriors watching their king learn that his oldest advisor had betrayed him, watching the moment that would define everything that came next. Why? Kael's voice was barely a whisper. Because your father made the same choice, and it got him killed. Because the mate bond will make you weak. Because the empire we built can't survive a king who puts One Omega above stability. Gareth's voice never wavered. I did this to save you from yourself. You did this to control me. Kael's hand went to his sword. You and Magnus and the rest of the council decided you knew better than your king. Decided my judgment was compromised. Decided murder was acceptable policy. It was necessary. Don't. The word cracked like a whip. Don't use that word. Don't justify treason by calling it necessity. Kael drew his sword in one smooth motion. The blade caught torchlight, edges gleaming. I've executed alphas for less. I've burned entire territories for questioning my authority. What makes you think I'd show mercy to you? Because I'm the one who held this empire together when you were too broken to rule. I'm the one who made the hard choices while you were hunting down rebels. I'm the one who... The sword moved faster than thought. One strike, clean, precise, the kind of kill that came from years of practice. Gareth dropped. Blood spread across stone. His eyes went wide with shock, then empty. Kael stood over his oldest advisor's corpse, and his hand was steady. No tremor, no hesitation, just the cold calculation of a king who'd learned that mercy got you killed. He looked up at Celine. The council. Where are they meeting? East Tower, but Kael... Stay here. He pointed at 2 warriors in the crowd below. You and you. Guard her. Anyone who gets within 10 feet without my direct order, you cut them down. Understood? Yes, my king. Kael moved toward the stairs, then stopped, looked back at Celine one more time, and she saw it in his eyes, the moment where the man who'd kissed her disappeared completely and the weapon took over. I built this empire on bodies, he said quietly. I can build another one the same way. He descended the stairs, and the warriors parted for him like water. Celine watched him cross the courtyard, 30 of his most loyal fighters falling into formation behind him. They moved with deadly purpose toward the East Tower, toward the council that had tried to kill his mate, toward the alphas who'd decided treason was acceptable, toward the betrayal that would force Kyle to choose between the king he'd become and the man he might have been. And Celine understood with horrible clarity that whatever happened next would change everything, because Kyle wasn't going to the East Tower for a conversation. He wasn't going for justice or trial or any civilized response. He was going to slaughter every single one of them. Tums. The East Tower door was closed but not locked. Kale kicked it open and stepped into a room where 6 alphas sat around a table covered in maps and documents. They looked up as one, their expressions shifting from surprise to calculation to fear in rapid succession. Magnus stood slowly. My king, the blood oath ceremony, is postponed. Kale moved into the room and his warriors fanned out behind him, blocking the exits. We have more pressing matters to discuss, like treason, like conspiracy to murder, like the fact that my oldest advisor just tried to kill my mate and admitted you were all involved. The temperature in the room plummeted. Vera recovered first. My king, if Gareth acted rashly, Gareth is dead. I killed him in the gallery 3 minutes ago. Kael's voice was empty of emotion. Now I'm here to find out who else needs to join him. Magnus's jaw tightened. You executed your chief advisor without trial, without hearing his defense. He admitted to conspiracy. That's all the trial I needed. Kael's hand rested on his sword hilt. Now I'll give you the same courtesy. Admit your involvement and die quickly. Lie to me and I'll make it last. Silence crashed over the room. Then Magnus did something unexpected. He smiled. Not warmly, not with humor, but with the grim satisfaction of a man who'd been proven right. There it is, he said quietly. The moment we've all been waiting for. The moment the mate bond finally compromises your judgment completely. He gestured around the room. Look at yourself, Kale. You just executed Gareth, the man who helped you build this empire, because he threatened the Omega. You're standing here ready to slaughter your entire council for the same reason, and you can't even see how perfectly you're fulfilling the prophecy. The prophecy says she'll destroy my reign, not that I will. The prophecy says an Omega with the Moonborn mark will shatter thrones built on fear and blood. You built your throne on exactly that. And right now, because of her, you're tearing apart the very foundation that's kept this empire stable. Magnus moved closer, fearless. You want to kill us? Fine. Execute every advisor who's served you loyally for 3 years. Then march to war with the Ironwood Pack while your entire command structure collapses. See how long the empire lasts when every alpha in the realm knows their king will sacrifice stability for sentiment. Kael's sword cleared its sheath. You tried to poison my mate. We tried to save you from repeating your father's mistakes. We tried to prevent the exact scenario that's happening right now. A king so compromised by attachment that he can't make rational decisions. Magnus's voice hardened. Your father chose love over strength. It got him killed and nearly destroyed the realm. We swore we'd never let that happen again. So you decided to murder an innocent woman. We decided to eliminate a threat. There's a difference. The words hung in the air like smoke. Kyle looked around the table at the faces of alphas who'd served him, advised him, helped him build order from chaos. Vera, with her strategic brilliance. Thorn, with his diplomatic connections. Corbin, with his military precision. Lissa, with her administrative genius. Magnus, with his institutional memory. Every one of them had been there when he needed guidance. Every one of them had helped him survive the transition from broken boy to ruthless king. Every one of them had just conspired to kill the woman his soul recognized as its other half. You're right about one thing, Kyle said finally. I am compromised. The mate bond does affect my judgment, but you're wrong about what that means. He sheathed his sword. Every person in the room tensed. I'm not going to kill you, Kyle continued, not because you don't deserve it, but because proving you wrong is worth more than your blood. He moved toward the door, then paused. You're all stripped of your positions, effective immediately. You have until dawn to leave Shadowmoor. Take whatever you can carry. Go wherever you want. But if I see any of you within my borders after sunrise, you'll learn exactly how creative I can be with executions." Magnus stepped forward. "You're exiling your entire council right before marching to war? That's madness. That's evolution." Kale met his eyes directly. "You said I built my throne on fear and blood. You're right, I did. And maybe that was necessary 3 years ago when everything was burning and I needed to establish dominance. But fear has diminishing returns. Eventually people become more afraid of living under tyranny than dying in rebellion. The Ironwood Pack is proof. So you'll what? Rule through kindness, through mercy." Vera's laugh was bitter. "That's not evolution, that's suicide." "I'll rule through loyalty earned instead of terror enforced. I'll build something that lasts because people choose it, not because they're too afraid to resist." Kale's voice hardened. "And if that fails, if the Empire collapses, at least I'll know I tried something other than becoming the very thing I swore to destroy." He walked to the door. His warriors parted for him. "You'll regret this," Magnus called after him. "When the Ironwood Pack tears through your borders, when other territories see weakness and mobilize, when the empire you built shatters because you chose one Omega over stability, you'll remember this moment and wish you'd listened." Kale stopped in the doorway, didn't turn around. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but at least I'll still be human enough to feel regret." He left. His warriors followed. The council sat in stunned silence, their power stripped, their influence shattered, their carefully laid plans reduced to ash. Because the king they'd tried to save from himself had just made a choice none of them anticipated. Not execution, not forgiveness, but exile. Removing them from power without giving them the martyr's death they'd probably expected. It was brutal in a completely different way, and it meant that whatever came next, Kael would face it without the advisors who'd helped him build his empire. He was choosing the unknown over the certain, the Omega over the institution, the man over the weapon. And that choice, that terrifying, irreversible choice, was about to change everything. Celine was still in the gallery when Kael returned. She'd watched him disappear into the East Tower. She'd counted the minutes. She'd felt the mate bond stretch and twist with emotions she couldn't fully parse. Rage, grief, determination, something that felt like liberation and terror tangled together. When he emerged, he was alone. No council members, no prisoners, just Kael and the 30 warriors who'd followed him. He climbed the stairs to the gallery and stopped in front of her. Blood speckled his armor, Gareth's blood, drying to rust in the torchlight. His eyes were storms. "They're alive," he said. "Exiled. They have until dawn to leave." Celine's breath caught. "You didn't kill them." "I thought about it. Spent the entire walk to the tower planning how I'd do it. Who'd die first? Who'd die slowest?" Kale's voice was rough. "But then I realized that's exactly what they'd expect. The brutal king, making brutal choices, proving them right about everything. So you exiled them instead." I removed the rot before it spread further. He reached out and touched her face gently, his calloused fingers tracing her jawline. "They were right about one thing. The mate bond does compromise me. I can't look at you and make the cold calculations a king is supposed to make. I can't weigh your life against imperial stability and come up with an acceptable loss ratio." Kael, let me finish. His thumb brushed her cheek. "I've spent 3 years building an empire on fear because I thought it was the only way to prevent what happened to my family. I thought if I was brutal enough, ruthless enough, cold enough, I'd never lose anything again. But all I did was make sure I had nothing left to lose. Until you." The mate bond pulled tight between them, recognition and hunger, and something deeper. "The council was trying to save me from myself," Kael continued. "They saw the mate bond as weakness, as compromise, as the thing that would destroy everything we'd built. And maybe they're right. Maybe choosing you over stability is exactly what the prophecy meant. Maybe I'm shattering my own throne. Or maybe you're just changing what it's built on. That's what I'm betting, that fear isn't the only foundation, that there's a way to rule that doesn't require becoming a monster." He leaned his forehead against hers. "But I need you to understand what this means. I just exiled my entire council. I have a war coming in 2 days. I have an empire that's fracturing, and the only person I have left to trust is an Omega I've known for 3 days who's prophesied to destroy me. Celine's hands came up to rest on his chest. She could feel his heartbeat through the armor, fast, unsteady. Then I guess we find out together if the prophecy is about destruction or transformation. And if it's destruction, then at least we'll face it as ourselves instead of the weapons we were forced to become. Kale kissed her then. Not gentle, not careful, but with the desperate intensity of someone who just burned down everything they knew and was reaching for the only solid thing left. Celine kissed him back and tasted smoke and blood and the bitter edge of fear. When they broke apart, Kyle kept his arms around her, holding her like she was the only thing preventing him from falling apart. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted quietly. "How to be a king and a mate. How to rule an empire and protect you. How to be strong enough to lead and vulnerable enough to love. Nobody knows how until they try. And if I fail, if the empire collapses, if the Ironwood Pact succeeds because I'm too distracted by keeping you safe, then we fail together and we figure out what comes next." Celine pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "But you're not alone anymore, KL. That's what the mate bond means. You don't have to carry everything by yourself." For a moment, just a moment, the Alpha King's armor cracked completely. And Celine saw the boy who'd come home to a castle full of corpses. The teenager who'd rebuilt an empire from grief and rage. The man who'd convinced himself that being alone was the same as being strong. "The blood moon ceremony," Kyle said, pulling himself back together with visible effort. "I still need to complete it. The warriors need to swear their oaths before we march. Then do it. I'll be right here." "No." Kael's grip tightened slightly. "You'll be beside me, where you belong." Celine's breath caught. "Kael, if you present me publicly as your mate right now, every alpha in the realm will know that I've chosen, that the Omega lives under my protection, that anyone who moves against her moves against me directly." His voice hardened. "Let them know. Let the Ironwood Pact know. Let every potential enemy understand that I'm not hiding my so-called weakness. I'm claiming it as strength." "That's insane. That's evolution." He took her hand. "The council was wrong about a lot of things, but they were right that I built my throne on fear. I'm choosing to build the next version on something else." "On what?" "On the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there's a way to rule that doesn't require forgetting how to be human." He started leading her toward the stairs. "Come on, we have oaths to swear and a war to prepare for. And I'm done pretending you're anything other than exactly what you are." They descended the stairs together. The courtyard fell silent as the warriors registered what they were seeing. The Alpha King holding hands with the Omega who'd caused all the chaos. The mate he'd chosen over his entire council. The woman prophesied to destroy his reign. Kale led Celine to the center of the ceremony circle and faced his assembled forces. Hundreds of alphas and betas who'd sworn loyalty to his brutal regime, who'd followed him into battle because they feared what would happen if they didn't. Now he was asking them to follow him into uncertainty. "The council is gone," Kyle announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtyard. "Exiled for treason, for attempting to murder my mate, for deciding they knew better than their king what was necessary for this empire's survival." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Shock, confusion, the beginning of fear. "I know what you're thinking," Kyle continued. "That I've lost my mind. That the mate bond has compromised my judgment. That choosing one Omega over the advisors who helped me build this empire is proof the prophecy is coming true." He paused, letting the words settle. "You might be right. This might be the beginning of my destruction. Or it might be the beginning of something better." He pulled Celine closer, his arm around her waist in a gesture of unmistakable claim. "I've ruled through fear for 3 years, made examples of anyone who questioned me, built stability through terror and brutality. And it worked. We have peace, we have order. We have an empire." His voice hardened. "But we also have the Ironwood Pact marching toward our borders because they think the mate bond makes me weak. We have fractures appearing because fear only works until it doesn't." The crowd was completely still now, listening. "So I'm trying something different. I'm keeping my mate. I'm ruling with advisors I trust instead of alphas who think murder is acceptable policy. I'm building an empire that lasts because people choose it, not because they're too afraid to resist. Kael's gaze swept his warriors. And I'm asking you to follow me into that uncertainty, to trust that maybe there's a way to be strong without being monsters, to believe that evolution is possible. Silence. Long, terrible. Then one warrior stepped forward, young, scarred from recent battles. He knelt and placed his fist over his heart. I swear my oath to the king who chooses truth over strategy, he said clearly. To the Alpha, who values life over fear. To the man who remembers what he's fighting for. Another warrior stepped forward. Then another. Then 10. Then 50. One by one, the assembled forces knelt and swore their oaths, not because they feared execution for refusing, but because Kael had just done something none of them expected. He'd been honest, vulnerable, human. And in an empire built on brutal certainty, that uncertainty was more powerful than any threat. Selene watched the warriors kneel and felt the enormity of what Kael had just done. He'd dismantled his own power structure. He'd exposed his so-called weakness. He'd made himself vulnerable in front of an army that had followed him specifically because he never showed vulnerability. It was either brilliant or suicidal. Maybe both. When the last warrior had sworn their oath, Kael turned to Selene. In front of everyone, in the torchlight and ceremony smoke, he cupped her face in both hands. I don't know if this is the right choice, he said quietly. I don't know if we'll survive what's coming, but I know that spending 3 more years being the weapon instead of the man will kill me just as surely as any prophecy. Then we find out together what happens when you choose to be both. He kissed her, in front of his entire army, in front of the empire he'd built, in front of gods and fate and prophecy. And Selene kissed him back, tasting the future they were choosing, uncertain, dangerous, and completely different from anything either of them had known. When they broke apart, Kael addressed his warriors one final time. The Ironwood Pack arrives in 2 days. We march at dawn. Prepare yourselves. This won't be like previous campaigns. They're not coming to raid borders. They're coming to remove a king they think has been compromised. His smile was all edges. Let's show them exactly how dangerous a compromised king can be. The warriors roared approval. The ceremony concluded. Orders were shouted. Preparations resumed. And Kael led Selene back through the castle toward the royal chambers, the mate bond singing between them with recognition and promise, and the terrifying knowledge that they'd just committed to a path neither could see the end of. Behind them, in the shadows of the East Tower, 6 former council members packed their belongings and prepared for exile. They'd failed to save the king from himself, failed to prevent the prophecy from unfolding. But as Magnus watched the Alpha King walk away with his Omega mate, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe the prophecy had always been about this moment. Not destruction through power, but destruction through transformation. The throne built on fear and blood was already shattering. What would rise in its place remained to be seen, and somewhere beyond Shadowmoor's borders, 300 Ironwood warriors continued their march, unaware that the king they were coming to depose had just become something far more dangerous than the brutal tyrant they expected. He'd become a man with something to protect, something to fight for beyond just survival, and that made him unpredictable, unstable, capable of anything. The blood moon rose full over the castle, bathing everything in crimson light, an omen, a warning, or maybe just a reminder that some changes only happen when you're willing to bleed for them. Kael and Selene stood at the window of the royal chambers and watched the moon climb higher. Tomorrow, they'd face war. Tomorrow, they'd discover if evolution was possible or if the prophecy would fulfill itself exactly as written. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Kael wasn't alone. And for the first time in 22 years, Selene wasn't a curse. They were just 2 people who'd found each other in the wreckage and decided that maybe the ruins were the only place anything new could grow. The mate bond pulled tight between them. Recognition, hunger, hope. And in the morning, when the army marched toward uncertain war, they'd face it together, changed, vulnerable, human. Exactly what the prophecy had promised all along. Dawn broke over Shadowmoor like a wound, red and raw and promising violence. Kael stood at the battlements watching his army assemble in the fields below. 3,000 warriors arranged in formations that had taken hours to perfect. Each unit knew their role. Each commander understood the strategy. Every piece was positioned exactly where it needed to be. It should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt like building a house on sand and calling it a fortress. The mate bond pulled tight in his chest. Celine was still in the royal chambers, awake but distant. She'd wanted to come to the battlements, but Kael had ordered her to stay inside the castle walls. Not because he doubted her courage, because he couldn't lead an army while feeling her fear bleeding through the bond every time an enemy got close. It was the kind of compromise that would have disgusted him 3 days ago. Now it was just survival. A scout approached at a run, breathing hard. Young. Terrified. The kind of fear that came from seeing something worse than you expected. "Report," Kael said without turning around. "The Ironwood Pack, my king. They're 5 miles out, but—" The scout's voice cracked. "It's not 300 warriors. It's closer to 800. They've been joined by the Stormclaw Pack and elements of the Ashbourne territories." Kael's hands tightened on the stone wall. 800, nearly a third of his own force. And they were all coming because they thought 1 Omega had compromised his judgment enough to make him vulnerable. They weren't wrong. They were just gambling that vulnerability meant weakness instead of desperation. "Composition?" Kael asked, his voice flat. "Heavy cavalry, siege equipment, supplies for a prolonged campaign." The scout swallowed hard. "My king, they're not coming to raid. They're coming to occupy." Of course they were. Because fear-based empires had one fatal flaw. The moment the fear cracked, every ambitious alpha saw an opening. Kael had built his throne by demonstrating that challenging him meant death. Now he'd exiled his entire council and publicly claimed a prophesied threat as his mate. To every watching territory, it looked like the brutal king had finally lost his mind. "Send word to all commanders, full defensive positions, archers on the walls, cavalry held in reserve until I give the order." Kyle turned to face the scout directly. "And send a rider to the Ironwood Alpha. Tell him if he wants my throne, I'll meet him in single combat, his life against mine. Winner takes the Empire. That way we can settle this without 800 corpses." The scout's eyes went wide. "My king, single combat against those odds are better than a pitched battle that decimates both our forces. Now go." The scout ran. Kael stayed on the battlements and watched the eastern horizon where dust was beginning to rise. 800 warriors. 3 separate packs united by the belief that he'd become too compromised to rule. The terrifying part was that they might be right. Kael had spent 3 years making decisions based on cold strategy. What benefited the Empire? What projected strength? What eliminated threats before they could metastasize? It was brutal but effective. Clean in the way that amputation was clean. Painful in the moment but preventing worse rot. But the moment Celine entered his life, everything became complicated. He couldn't look at strategic decisions without seeing her face. Couldn't calculate acceptable losses without feeling the mate bond pull tight. Couldn't be the weapon the Empire needed because part of him was too busy being human. And humans were fragile. Humans made mistakes. Humans lost wars because they cared about the wrong things at the wrong time. Footsteps behind him. Kael didn't turn. He knew that presence. "You're thinking about sending me away," Celine said quietly. Not a question. "I'm thinking about a lot of things. Like how much easier this would be if you just let the council kill me." She moved to stand beside him at the wall. How many lives it would save. How much simpler the choice would be. "Don't put words in my mouth." "Then tell me I'm wrong." Kael was silent for a long moment. Below, his warriors continued their preparations. Sharpening weapons, checking armor, making the small rituals that helped people feel ready for violence. "You're not wrong," he said finally. "If you were dead, the Ironwood Pack would have no justification for this assault. The other territories wouldn't have united against me. I could rule the same way I have for 3 years, and the Empire would remain stable." "So why didn't you let them poison me?" "Because stable isn't the same as right. Because I'm tired of making decisions that require forgetting I'm human." He looked at her then. "And because the moment I felt the mate bond, I knew that losing you would break something in me that even losing my family didn't touch." Celine's hand found his. Their fingers laced together and Kael felt the warmth of it even through his gloves. "I can help," she said. "In the battle. I can heal your wounded. I can—" "No." The word came out harsher than intended. "You stay in the castle, behind the walls, where the bond won't distract me every time someone gets close to you." "Kael, I'm not fragile. I know, but I am when it comes to you. He squeezed her hand. 3 days ago, I could make tactical decisions without hesitation. Now every choice is filtered through whether it puts you at risk. That makes me vulnerable. It makes me dangerous to everyone depending on me to lead. Then maybe you need to trust that I can handle myself. Trust has nothing to do with it. The mate bond doesn't care about capability. It only cares about keeping you alive. And if I'm in the middle of commanding a battle and I feel you getting hurt, he stopped. I'll abandon my warriors to get to you. I won't be able to stop myself, and that will get people killed. Celine was quiet. Then she pulled her hand away and Kael felt the loss of contact like a wound. You're right, she said softly. The bond makes you vulnerable. But not because I'm weak, because you're still trying to do this alone. Still trying to be the weapon instead of accepting that maybe you need to be something different now. What else is there? I'm a king at war. Weapons are all I have. You have people willing to follow you because you were honest with them. You have an empire that's fracturing not because you're weak, but because you're changing. You have a mate who understands that sometimes the only way to survive is to become something new. She met his eyes directly. But you can't evolve while still clinging to the things that kept you brutal. Before Kael could respond, horns sounded from the eastern watchtowers. 3 short blasts. Enemy sighted. The Ironwood pack had arrived. The army that emerged from the dust was larger than the scouts had reported. Not 800. Closer to 1,000. They spread across the eastern fields like a stain, their banners snapping in the wind, Ironwood's silver wolf, Stormclaw's lightning bolt, Ashbourne's burning tree. 3 packs united. 3 alphas who'd decided that Kael's so-called compromise made him ripe for removal. Kael descended from the battlements and mounted his warhorse in the courtyard. His commanders assembled around him, younger than his former council, promoted in the chaos of the previous night. They looked nervous, uncertain. Exactly the opposite of what an army needed right before battle. Listen carefully, Kael said, his voice carrying to every mounted warrior. The Ironwood Alpha is going to demand single combat. He'll frame it as honor, as tradition, as a way to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. He paused. It's a trap. The moment I engage him, his forces will attack our lines. They're betting I'll be too distracted to respond effectively. So you'll refuse the combat? One commander asked. No, I'll accept. But I need you ready to respond the moment their forces move. Cavalry hits their flanks. Archers focus on their command structure. Infantry holds the center. Kael's gaze swept his officers. We're outnumbered, but we have defensive position. Use it. Make them pay for every foot of ground. And if you fall in single combat, my king? The question everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to ask. Then you retreat to the castle and hold until reinforcements arrive from the southern territories. Celine becomes your priority. Get her out through the hidden passages and to the coast. There are ships waiting in the harbor that will take her beyond the realm. Kael's voice hardened. But I don't plan on falling. I plan on showing the Ironwood Alpha exactly what happens when you mistake evolution for weakness. He spurred his horse forward. The gates opened. Kael rode out with 30 of his best warriors flanking him, a ceremonial guard for a conversation that would determine whether thousands lived or died. The Ironwood Alpha waited in the center of the field between the 2 armies. Tall, broad, covered in scars that told the story of decades spent fighting. His name was Ragnar Ironwood, and he'd built his pack through conquest and brutality. Exactly the kind of alpha who'd see Kael's changing approach as proof of compromise. Kael stopped 10 feet away. The mate bond pulled tight in his chest. Celine was watching from the battlements despite his orders. He could feel her fear bleeding through the connection. You came a long way to die, Kael said conversationally. Ragnar smiled. I came to remove a compromised king before he destroys the stability we've all benefited from. His voice was deep, confident. 3 years ago, you united these territories through fear, through demonstrating that challenging you meant annihilation. We respected that. We followed that. We built our packs knowing the rules. And now you think the rules have changed. Now we know they have. You exiled your entire council. You publicly claimed an Omega prophesied to destroy your reign. You've shown vulnerability. Ragnar gestured at the assembled forces behind him. Vulnerability invites challenge. That's basic pack dynamics. You taught us that. I taught you that brutal consistency creates predictable stability. I never said evolution was impossible. Evolution is a word weak kings use when they can't maintain dominance. Ragnar's hand went to his sword. I'm offering you single combat, your life against mine. Winner takes the empire. This way we settle the question of leadership without decimating our combined forces. Efficient, strategic, the kind of decision a real king would make. Kale felt the trap closing. If he refused, he looked afraid. If he accepted, Ragnar's forces would attack the moment the combat began. Either way, the Ironwood Alpha was betting he'd gained enough advantage to win. But Ragnar was making the same mistake the Council had made. He was assuming vulnerability meant weakness instead of recognizing it as a different kind of strength. I accept your challenge, Kale said clearly. Single combat, to the death, witnessed by both armies. He raised his voice so it carried across the field. But understand this. When I kill you, every alpha who followed you here will swear loyalty to me or join you in whatever comes after. Those are the stakes, your life and your followers' freedom. Ragnar's smile widened. Agreed. And when I kill you, your territories submit to Ironwood authority, and the Omega burns as the prophecy demands. The mate bond flared sharp with Celine's terror. Kale forced himself not to react. Then we understand each other. He dismounted and drew his sword. The field emptied as both sides pulled back to give them space. 2 alphas, 1 empire. Everything riding on who could kill the other first. Ragnar moved first, fast for his size, his blade coming in low and vicious. Kale blocked and countered, their swords meeting with a sound like thunder. Steel screamed against steel. They broke apart and circled. You're slower than I expected, Ragnar said. Distracted, the mate bond pulling your focus. Keep thinking that. Kale attacked in a blur of motion, 3 strikes so fast they blended together. Ragnar blocked 2, but the third opened a line across his shoulder. First blood. They crashed together again, and the world narrowed to the space between their blades. Ragnar fought like a brawler, all power and aggression, using his size to create overwhelming pressure. Kale fought like an assassin, precise strikes, economy of motion, waiting for the opening that would end it. But Kale could feel the mate bond pulling tighter with every exchange. Selena's fear was becoming his fear. Her desperate need for him to survive was bleeding into his concentration. Every time Ragnar's blade got close, Kyle felt it through the bond like Selene was the one being cut. It was exactly what Ragnar had counted on. The Ironwood Alpha pressed his advantage, driving Kale back step by step. Their swords locked and Ragnar leaned in close. You've already lost, he whispered. The moment you let yourself care about her, you stopped being the king we feared. Now you're just another alpha who'll die for sentiment. He shoved Kyle back and signaled his forces. Horns blasted. The Ironwood army charged. The trap sprung exactly as Kyle had predicted, but knowing it was coming didn't make it easier to counter. Ragnar's forces hit Kyle's lines while their leader kept him occupied in single combat. It was dishonorable. It was effective. It was exactly what Kyle would have done 3 years ago. Kyle's commanders responded immediately, cavalry wheeling to meet the flanking assault, archers raining death on the charging infantry, shields locking in defensive formation. But they were outnumbered, and the coordination was imperfect. Warriors fell. Lines buckled. The careful strategy began fragmenting into chaos, and Kyle was stuck in single combat with an alpha who'd just proven he had no intention of fighting honorably. Ragnar came at him again, using the distraction of the larger battle to land hits Kyle would normally block. A cut across the ribs. A slash on the thigh. Minor wounds, but accumulating. Death by 1,000 cuts while Kyle's army died around him. The mate bond screamed. Selene was in agony, feeling every wound through their connection. Kale could barely focus through the feedback loop of pain and fear. Then something changed. The bond flared with a different emotion. Not fear, determination. Selene had made a choice. Kale felt it the moment she left the castle. Felt her moving toward the battlefield despite his orders. Felt her intention burning through the connection like fire. She was coming to heal his wounded, to turn the tide, to prove she wasn't the weakness everyone claimed. And she was walking straight into a battlefield where 1,000 warriors wanted her dead. No, Kyle breathed, then louder, desperate. Fall back! Protect the Omega! but his voice was lost in the chaos of battle. His warriors were too occupied staying alive to hear orders, and Selene was already past the gates, already moving into the killing field with nothing but courage and a gift for healing. Ragnar saw the change in Kael's expression and laughed. There it is, the compromise, the vulnerability. You can't even focus on killing me because you're too busy worrying about her. He was right. Kael's concentration was fracturing. Part of him was fighting Ragnar. Part of him was tracking Selene through the bond. Part of him was watching his empire collapse in real time. The weapon would have ignored the bond, would have killed Ragnar and dealt with Selene after, would have made the cold calculation that one Omega wasn't worth losing a battle. But Kael wasn't the weapon anymore. He was the man who'd chosen evolution over brutality. And that choice was about to cost him everything. Ragnar's blade came in fast and Kael barely blocked it. The impact sent shockwaves up his arm. His wounds were slowing him. The mate bond was distracting him. The battle was turning against his forces. He was losing, actually losing, for the first time since taking the throne. Then he felt it through the bond. Selene reaching the wounded, Selene placing her hands on a dying warrior. Selene's power flaring to life, not the destructive force the prophecy promised, but something else. Something that brought a man back from the edge of death and put him back in the fight. She healed 3 warriors in rapid succession. Then 5. Then 10. Each one rising with renewed strength, their loyalty to the king who'd protected their healer absolute. The tide didn't turn, but it stopped hemorrhaging quite so fast. Kael used the moment of Ragnar's distraction to strike. His blade found the Ironwood Alpha's side, a deep cut that would slow him. They broke apart, both bleeding, both exhausted. Clever, Ragnar panted, using her as a tactical advantage. But it doesn't change the math. We still outnumber you. We still have the momentum. And she can't heal everyone. She doesn't have to heal everyone. She just has to prove that loyalty earned is worth more than fear enforced. Kael attacked again, pushing through his wounds and the bond's distraction. This time he wasn't fighting as the brutal king or the vulnerable mate. He was fighting as both, the weapon and the man. The alpha who'd built an empire on corpses, and the one who'd chosen to evolve. It was messy. It was imperfect. It was the most human he'd been in 3 years. Their blades met again and again, neither able to gain decisive advantage. Around them, the battle raged, Kael's forces holding through sheer determination, Ragnar's forces pressing through superior numbers. Warriors fell on both sides. Blood soaked into the ground until the field looked like it was bleeding. And through it all, Selene moved like a ghost, healing the dying, pulling warriors back from the edge, proving that the prophesied destroyer could also be a savior. Ragnar saw it too, saw his advantage crumbling as Kael's forces rallied around the Omega they'd sworn to protect, saw the brutal king fighting like someone with something to lose, saw the mate bond that was supposed to be weakness becoming something else entirely. "This isn't over," Ragnar snarled. "Even if you kill me, my forces won't submit. They'll burn your empire to ash." Then I guess we find out if ash makes better fertilizer than fear. Kael drove forward with everything he had left. Their swords locked one final time. They were face to face, both warriors realizing this was the moment that would define everything after. Then Kael felt it through the bond. Sharp, immediate, terrible. Someone had reached Selene, an Ironwood warrior who'd broken through the defensive line. His blade was raised. Selene was exposed. The mate bond screamed. Time fractured. Kael had a choice. Finish Ragnar and lose Selene, or abandon the combat and save his mate while losing the battle. Every strategic instinct he'd honed over 3 years said, finish the fight. Kill Ragnar. Win the combat. The battle would follow. But the man he'd become, the one who'd chosen evolution over brutality, couldn't make that calculation. Kael shoved Ragnar back and ran. He heard the Ironwood Alphas laugh behind him, heard his warriors' confusion, heard the battle shift as both armies realized their leaders had abandoned the sacred combat. None of it mattered, only reaching Selene before the blade fell. Kael crashed through fighting warriors like they didn't exist. The mate bond pulled him straight to her. He saw the Ironwood warrior's sword descending, saw Selene raising her hands to defend herself, saw the moment about to happen that would break him completely. He reached her half a second before the blade, threw himself between Selene and death, felt steel punch through his armor and into his side. The wound was deep, possibly fatal. Kyle dropped to his knees, keeping himself between the warrior and Celine. "Run!" he managed to gasp. "Get back to the castle." But Celine didn't run. She dropped beside him and pressed her hands to his wound. Her power flared, silver light that blazed from the moonborn marks on her spine. It poured into Kyle like liquid fire, knitting flesh, stopping bleeding, pulling him back from the edge. The healing hurt worse than the wound. Kyle's vision whited out. When it cleared, he was on his feet again, the injury reduced to a scar. And Celine was glowing. The moonborn marks had activated completely. Silver light radiated from her skin, her eyes, her hands. Every warrior within 20 feet had stopped fighting to stare. This was the power the prophecy had promised. This was what the council had feared. This was the force that could level cities and stop Alpha hearts. Kale felt it through the bond, Celine's consciousness expanding, her awareness touching every living thing on the battlefield. She could feel their fear, their pain, their desperate need for the violence to end, and she could end it, right now. One thought and every Alpha on the field would drop dead. The prophecy fulfilled exactly as written. "Celine," Kale said quietly, "look at me." Her glowing eyes found his. Behind them, he could see her struggling with the power, with the rage at years of abuse, with the exhaustion of trying to save people who'd always seen her as expendable. "You can stop this," Kyle continued. "You can kill everyone who's ever hurt you, everyone who's tried to use you, everyone who thought you were weak." He stepped closer, ignoring the shocked armies around them. "But that's not who you are. That's not why the power woke up." "They tried to kill you," Celine's voice echoed with otherworldly resonance. "They'll keep trying. As long as I exist, they'll see you as compromised. Let them. I'd rather be compromised and human than brutal and alone. Even if it costs you the empire? Especially then, because empires built on fear collapse eventually. But something built on choice, on people following because they want to instead of because they're afraid, that might actually last." The silver light pulsed brighter. Kale could feel the power building. Celine was seconds away from making a choice that would define everything after. Around them, the battlefield had gone silent. 1,000 warriors watching the Omega decide their fate. Ragnar's voice cut through the tension. "Do it. Prove the prophecy right. Destroy him. Destroy all of us. Show the realm what happens when an Alpha King chooses sentiment over strength." Celine turned to look at the Ironwood Alpha. The silver light focused on him like a weapon. "You think this is sentiment?" Her voice carried across the field. "You think choosing to heal instead of harm is weakness? You think evolution means compromise? I think you're everything the Council feared. Power without control. Destruction waiting to happen." "Then watch me prove you wrong." The silver light exploded outward. Every warrior on the battlefield felt it. A wave of energy that touched their minds, their hearts, their very souls. It didn't kill them. It didn't harm them. It healed them. Every wound closed. Every broken bone mended. Every dying warrior pulled back from the edge. The moonborn power that was supposed to destroy instead became the largest act of healing in recorded history. When the light faded, Celine collapsed. Kale caught her before she hit the ground. Her eyes had returned to normal. The marks on her spine had gone dark. She'd burned through every ounce of power in a single moment of defiance. "Why?" Kale whispered. "Because someone had to prove there's a better way." She looked up at him, exhausted but alive. "Because you chose to evolve, and I chose to help you." The battlefield remained silent. Every warrior touched by the healing stood in shock, trying to understand what had just happened. Finally, Ragnar spoke. His voice had lost its confidence. "This changes nothing. We still came to remove a compromised king." "No." The word came from one of Ragnar's own warriors, a young beta who'd been dying 30 seconds ago. "You came to remove a king you thought was weak, but we just watched the Omega prophesied to destroy him, heal everyone on this field, including your forces, including warriors who wanted her dead." He dropped his weapon. "That's not weakness. That's power choosing mercy. And I'm done following alphas who can't see the difference." Another warrior laid down his weapon. Then 10. Then 50. One by one, Ragnar's army abandoned their positions and knelt. Not in submission. In recognition that maybe the prophecy had been fulfilled, just not the way anyone expected. Ragnar stood alone, his forces behind him, his justification for war dissolving in real time. "You've lost," Kael said quietly. "Not because I'm stronger, because we're offering something better than fear. Join us, or leave. But the war ends now." For a long moment, Ragnar stared at the kneeling warriors, at the Omega who defied prophecy, at the king who'd chosen evolution. Then he dropped his sword. "The war ends," he said roughly. "But you haven't won, Draven. You've just delayed the inevitable. Fear works because it's reliable. What you're building, loyalty through choice, strength through mercy, it'll collapse the moment you face something worse than me. Then we'll face it together, and we'll keep evolving until we find something that lasts." Kael looked out over the battlefield, at the warriors from 3 separate packs all kneeling in recognition of something new, at Selene unconscious in his arms, having spent everything to prove healing was stronger than harm, at an empire that had just transformed from brutal efficiency into uncertain hope. It was messy, it was imperfect, it had cost blood and pain and the dissolution of everything he'd built before. But it was honest, it was human, it was the beginning of something that might actually be worth protecting. The sun climbed higher over the field of warriors who'd come for war and found transformation instead. The blood moon ceremony was finally complete, not through oaths sworn in blood, but through choices made in the space between destruction and mercy. Kael carried Selene back toward Shadowmoor. His forces followed, and behind them, 800 warriors from 3 different packs began the slow process of becoming something other than weapons. The prophecy had promised an Omega who would destroy thrones built on fear and blood. It never said she'd use power to do it. Sometimes the strongest act of destruction is choosing not to. Selene woke to silence, not the empty silence of her cell in the Bloodfang pack, not the nervous silence of her tower prison, but the profound quiet that came after storms, when the violence had passed and the world was taking inventory of what survived. She opened her eyes to find herself in the royal chambers. Afternoon light streamed through the windows, warm and golden. Her body ached in ways that had nothing to do with injury. The moonborn power had burned through her like wildfire, leaving every nerve raw and hypersensitive. But she was alive. Kael sat in a chair beside the bed, still wearing his battle-damaged armor. Blood and dirt caked the leather. His face was carved from exhaustion. But his eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had terrified her in the arena, watched her with something that looked like reverence. "How long?" Selene's voice came out rough. 18 hours. You collapsed after healing 800 warriors simultaneously. Maven said your heart stopped twice before we got you stable." His hand found hers, fingers lacing together. "Don't ever do that again. Heal people or save your life. Burn yourself out trying to prove everyone wrong." But there was no anger in his voice, just bone-deep relief. Selene pushed herself upright slowly. Every muscle protested. Through the windows, she could see Shadowmoor's courtyards filled with warriors. Not just Kael's forces, but the combined armies that had come for war. They were sitting in mixed groups, sharing food, tending wounds that no longer existed. "What happened after I passed out?" Ragnar surrendered, formally, in front of both armies. Then he swore a modified oath, not submission, but alliance. His pack maintains autonomy but agrees to unified defense and trade agreements. Kael's mouth twisted. It's messier than conquest, more complicated than fear-based submission. But it's what we have. And the other alphas? Most followed Ragnar's example. A few refused and left. They'll cause problems eventually, but not today. He stood and moved to the window, looking out over the transformed battlefield. "I've spent the last 18 hours trying to figure out how to govern an empire that's half brutal efficiency and half uncertain hope. It's like trying to build a bridge while standing on both sides of the canyon." Selene watched him struggle with the contradiction he'd become. The Alpha King who'd ruled through fear, now trying to lead people who'd chosen to follow. The weapon learning to be human. The man discovering that evolution was harder than destruction. "You're afraid you made the wrong choice," she said quietly. "I'm afraid I made a choice I can't sustain, that keeping you alive will cost more lives than executing you would have saved, that the council was right, and I'm just too compromised to see it." He turned to face her. 800 warriors watched you heal them, watched you choose mercy over vengeance. watched you fulfill the prophecy in the most unexpected way possible. And you know what terrifies me? That moment only worked because you were strong enough to make it. Next time, I might not be so lucky. Next time, you might not need me to save you. You might save yourself. I've been saving myself for 3 years. It turned me into something barely human. Then maybe the point is learning to save yourself without losing your humanity in the process. Celine pushed back the furs and stood slowly. Her legs shook but held. You keep acting like choosing me means choosing weakness. But what if choosing me means choosing the hard work of actually becoming someone worth following instead of someone too terrifying to challenge? Kale crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. Not rough, not demanding, just desperate to hold something real. I don't know how to be that person, he admitted against her hair. I don't know how to rule without fear, how to make decisions that aren't calculated brutality, how to look at problems and see solutions that don't involve executions. Then we figure it out together. Make mistakes, fail sometimes, build something imperfect instead of perfectly brutal. She pulled back enough to meet his eyes. The prophecy said, I'd shatter your throne. I did. The one built on fear and blood is gone. Now we build something else. And if what we build collapses, then we build it again and again until we find something that actually lasts. Kael kissed her then, slow, searching, like a man learning a new language and wanting to get every word right. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. Maven wants to see you, he said quietly. She's been waiting outside since you woke up. Says she has news you'll want to hear. What kind of news? The kind that means everything's changing faster than I can control. He moved to the door and opened it. Maven entered carrying a bundle of documents and wearing an expression Celine had never seen on her. Something that looked almost like hope. You're awake. Good. We have decisions to make and not much time. Maven set the documents on the table and turned to Kael. The Southern Territories sent word. They heard about the battle, about the Omega healing both armies, about the prophecy being fulfilled through mercy instead of destruction. And? Kael's voice was carefully neutral. And they want to know if the Alliance offer extends to them. If the empire that was built on fear is actually transforming into something else. Maven's smile was grim. You've got a problem, my king. Success. Half the realm is watching to see if this new approach works. The other half is preparing to exploit it the moment it fails. Kael moved to the window again, his favorite position for thinking. How many territories are asking about alliance versus submission? 6 asking about alliance. 2 declaring independence, 3 waiting to see which way the wind blows. Maven pulled out a map and spread it across the table. The empire you built through conquest is fracturing, but something else is forming, something voluntary, something that might actually be stronger if you can figure out how to manage it. Celine joined them at the table, studying the map. Red marks indicated territories in open rebellion. Blue marks showed alliance requests. Gray marks were the uncertain ones. The colors formed a pattern that looked less like an empire and more like a web. This is chaos, Kael said flatly. This is evolution, Maven corrected. Messy, unpredictable, requiring actual diplomacy instead of just threatening to burn everyone who disagrees. She looked at Celine. Which is where you come in. The territories asking for alliance aren't doing it because they fear the king. They're doing it because they saw what the Omega did. They want access to healing. They want the hope that maybe there's a different way. You want to use me as leverage. Celine kept her voice neutral. I want to use you as what you actually are. Proof that power doesn't have to destroy. That the prophecy wasn't about ending the reign but transforming it. Maven's expression softened slightly. The queen used to say that empires built on fear collapse when the fear fades. But empires built on mutual benefit can last generations. You just gave us the beginning of mutual benefit. Now we have to figure out how to scale it. Kael turned from the window. You're suggesting we offer healing in exchange for alliance. Trade the Omega's power for loyalty. I'm suggesting we offer hope in exchange for cooperation. There's a difference. Maven met his eyes steadily. You ruled through making examples, through showing everyone what happened when they crossed you. It worked because you were willing to be more brutal than anyone else. But now you're trying something different. So the question becomes, what do you have to offer that's worth more than fear? The room fell silent. Outside, the mixed armies continued their careful coexistence. Inside, 3 people were trying to figure out how to govern an empire that was becoming something none of them fully understood. Celine spoke first. I won't be used as a weapon, not for destruction and not for leverage. If territories want alliance, it has to be because they choose cooperation, not because they're buying access to my power. Then what do you suggest? Kael asked. I suggest we're honest. We tell them the empire is changing, that we're building something based on choice instead of coercion. That healing is available to allies, but it's not transactional. It's part of what we stand for now. She looked at the map, at the chaos of colors. Some will join, some won't. Some will wait to see if we survive, but at least it'll be real. Maven nodded slowly. That's either brilliant or suicidal, possibly both. Everything about this situation is both, Kael said. The question is whether we commit fully or try to hedge our bets. You can't hedge, Celine said firmly. You're either the brutal king or the evolving one. You can't be both and expect people to trust you. They need to know what you stand for. Kael looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Maven. Send word to all territories. The Empire of Fear is finished. We're building an alliance based on mutual benefit and voluntary cooperation. Territories can join through treaty, maintain independence through neutrality, or declare opposition and face the consequences. But the consequences won't be annihilation, they'll be isolation. You're giving up your most powerful tool, Maven said quietly, the threat of overwhelming force. No, I'm replacing it with something that might actually last. The promise of something better than constant territorial wars. He looked at the map again. How many territories do you think will actually join voluntarily? Half, maybe. The ones who are tired of constant conflict and see this as a way out. And the other half? We'll wait to see if you survive your first real crisis under the new system. If you do, they'll join. If you don't, they'll pick apart whatever's left. Maven began rolling up the map. You're gambling everything on the hope that cooperation beats coercion. History suggests you're wrong. History also suggests that empires built on fear eventually collapse under their own weight. At least this way we're trying something different. Kael moved to Celine's side. Start drafting the treaties. Make them fair but clear. We offer protection, trade access, and healing to allies. In exchange, we expect mutual defense and open borders. No submission, no tribute, just cooperation. Maven's expression shifted to something almost like respect. The council would have fought you on every word of this. The council tried to poison my mate to preserve a system they understood. I'm done prioritizing their comfort over actual progress. His hand found Celine's. We move forward, whatever that looks like. Maven left to begin the diplomatic work. When the door closed, Celine and Kael stood together looking at the map still spread across the table. An empire fragmenting, an alliance forming, the future completely uncertain. This could all fall apart, Kael said quietly. Within a year, we could be fighting wars on 6 fronts against territories that see our new approach as weakness. Or within a year, we could have built something stable enough that the old way looks barbaric in comparison. You have a lot of faith in people's better nature. I have faith that most people are tired of constant violence, that they'd choose peace if someone offered them a real alternative. She squeezed his hand. You spent 3 years proving you were too dangerous to challenge. Now spend the next 3 proving you're too valuable to abandon. Kael pulled her closer. And if I fail? If the empire collapses and everything we're building turns to ash? Then at least you'll fail as yourself instead of as the weapon you forced yourself to become. The words settled between them like a vow. Outside, the sun began its descent toward evening. The armies that had come for war started the slow process of becoming something else, and in the royal chambers of Shadowmoor Castle, 2 people who'd been prophesied to destroy each other were learning how to build instead. Okay. 3 days later, the First Alliance Treaty was signed. The Southern Coastal Territories agreed to terms in a ceremony that was deliberately nothing like Kael's previous conquests. No mass oath-swearing, no displays of overwhelming force. Just representatives from both sides sitting at a table and negotiating until they found language everyone could accept. It took 6 hours. It was boring. It was diplomatic. It was the opposite of everything Kael had done for 3 years. And it worked. Celine watched from the gallery as the signatures were finalized. She'd been asked to attend as proof that the Omega lived and the prophecy had been fulfilled without bloodshed. Maven had wanted her to demonstrate healing as part of the ceremony. Celine had refused. "I'm not a performance," she'd said. "If they need proof, they can hear it from the 800 warriors who were there." Kael had backed her without hesitation. It was a small thing, but small things accumulated into trust. After the signing, there was a feast. Nothing elaborate, just food and drink and the careful social dance of former enemies learning to be allies. Selena sat beside Kael at the high table and watched him navigate conversations with diplomatic skill she hadn't known he possessed. He was still blunt, still direct, still carried himself like violence given form. But there was something different now. A willingness to listen before acting. A recognition that not every problem required a brutal solution. Evolution in real time. Ragnar approached midway through the feast. The Ironwood Alpha had stayed in Shadowmoor as part of the negotiation process. He'd been professional but distant, clearly struggling with the shift from opponent to ally. "A word, my king?" Ragnar's tone was careful. Kael nodded, and they moved to a quieter corner of the hall. Celine stayed at the table but watched them through the crowd. She could feel Kael's tension through the mate bond. The conversation was brief. When Kael returned, his expression was unreadable. "What did he want?" Celine asked quietly. "To tell me I was right. That cooperation might actually work better than fear." Kael took a long drink. He hated admitting it, but his pack has already seen benefits from the alliance. Trade routes that were closed under the old system, healing access for warriors who'd be dead or crippled, actual stability instead of constant preparation for the next territorial war. That's good, isn't it? It's terrifying, because it means I can't go back. Even if this all falls apart, even if we face something that requires the old brutality, I've already demonstrated there's another way. The moment I revert to executions and fear tactics, everyone will know I failed. He looked at her. "You've locked me into evolution whether I'm ready for it or not." "Good, because being ready is overrated. Most important changes happen when you're completely unprepared and desperately improvising." Kael's laugh was rough, but genuine. "Is that the Omega wisdom that's supposed to guide me through rebuilding an empire?" "That's the human wisdom that applies to anyone trying to become something better than what broke them." She took his hand under the table. "You were shaped by losing everything. You became brutal because Mercy got your family killed. But staying brutal was just another way of dying. You were becoming the thing you hated. And now? Now you're becoming someone who might actually deserve the loyalty he's asking for." The words hit harder than she'd intended. Kael was silent for a long moment, processing. "My father believed loyalty was earned through fairness and honor," he said finally. "He died for that belief. I decided loyalty could only be enforced through fear. Now I'm trying something in between, loyalty through mutual benefit, through actually giving people something worth protecting." He met her eyes. "But I still don't know if it's enough. If I'm enough to make this work." "Nobody's enough alone. That's why we have each other." "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple. It's just true. You don't have to carry everything by yourself anymore. That's what the mate bond means. That's what alliance means. That's what building something together instead of ruling through isolation means." Kael pulled her closer, his arm around her waist in a gesture that had become natural over the past few days. "I spent 3 years making sure I had nothing left to lose. Now I have everything to lose. You, the Empire, the fragile alliances we're building. The hope that maybe this actually works. Then I guess you'll have to become someone who can protect all of it without destroying yourself in the process. And if I can't, then we fail together and figure out what comes next." The feast continued around them. Laughter and conversation filled the hall. Enemies becoming allies, territories finding common ground, an empire transforming in ways no one could predict. It was messy and imperfect and completely uncertain. It was also the most human Kael had been in 3 years. 1 month later, Celine stood in the courtyard watching Kael train with his warriors. The brutal efficiency was still there. He moved like a weapon forged through necessity. But something had changed. He paused to correct technique instead of just demonstrating superiority. He answered questions instead of demanding silent obedience. Small changes. But small changes built empires differently than fear did. Maven approached from the main hall carrying another bundle of documents. More alliance requests, 4 new territories, 2 wanting full integration, 2 preferring looser affiliation. How's Kyle handling the diplomatic load? Like someone who'd rather be fighting but recognizes talking is more sustainable. Maven's smile was wry. He's learning, slowly, with significant frustration, but he's learning. And the territories that declared independence? Quiet so far. Watching. Waiting to see if we survive our first real crisis under the new system. Maven set down the documents. Which brings me to why I came out here. We have a situation developing in the eastern borderlands. Raiders from outside the Alliance territories. They're betting our new approach means we won't respond with overwhelming force. Celine's stomach tightened. Are they right? That's what we're about to find out. Kyle's meeting with his military advisors in an hour to decide response options. Maven studied her carefully. This is the test. The first time violence might actually be necessary under the new system. We'll see if he can respond without reverting to the brutal king everyone fears. When Maven left, Celine made her way to the strategy chamber. Kyle was already there, surrounded by maps and reports. His new advisors, younger, promoted from the ranks, chosen for capability rather than political influence, were debating response options. They fell silent when Celine entered. Kyle looked up, and something in his expression eased. The Eastern Raiders, Celine said. Maven told me. 30 warriors, hitting supply convoys, targeting civilian settlements. Kale's voice was controlled, but she could feel his rage through the bond. They're testing us, seeing if the new alliance means we've gone soft. What are your options? Overwhelming military response. We send 500 warriors, annihilate the raiders, leave their bodies as a warning. It's what I would have done a month ago. He gestured at the maps. Or we send a smaller force, capture instead of kill, bring them back for trial. Demonstrate that we respond to violence, but with proportional force instead of annihilation. What does your instinct say? My instinct says burn them all and make sure everyone knows what happens when they target civilians under Alliance protection. His hands were fists on the table. But my instinct was shaped by 3 years of ruling through terror. I'm trying to build something different. One of the younger advisors spoke up. My king, if we don't respond decisively, other groups will see it as weakness. We'll have raiders on every border. And if we respond with annihilation, we prove that the new alliance is just the old brutality with better marketing. Kale looked at Celine. You're the one who keeps talking about evolution. What do you think? Every eye in the room turned to her. Celine moved closer to the maps, studying the raider positions. I think proportional response is right. But I also think you need to demonstrate that mercy has limits. So you send a force large enough to capture the raiders decisively. You bring them back, you give them trial, and then you make a choice based on what you find. She met Kyle's eyes. If they're desperate refugees, you offer integration under strict terms. If they're opportunistic predators, you execute their leaders and absorb the rest into labor battalions. Either way, you show that the alliance responds but with justice instead of just revenge. The room was silent. Then one of the advisors nodded slowly. It's more complex than annihilation, but it sends a better message. Complex is the point, Kyle said. We're building something that requires actual thought instead of just reflexive violence. He started issuing orders. Assemble a force of 200, mixed cavalry and infantry, commanders with diplomatic training. Tell them the objective is capture and return for trial. Anyone who kills unnecessarily answers to me directly. The advisors scattered to implement the plan. When the room cleared, Celine and Kyle stood alone with the maps. This is harder than ruling through fear, Kyle admitted. That's because you're actually trying to be fair instead of just efficient. Fairness is expensive. It takes time. It requires nuance. It creates complications that simple brutality avoids. And it builds something that lasts instead of something that collapses the moment you show weakness. Celine moved into his arms. You're doing it, Kyle. Actually changing. It's messy, and you're going to make mistakes. But you're becoming someone who leads instead of just dominates. He held her close, his chin resting on top of her head. Through the bond, she felt the constant war inside him, the weapon and the man, the brutal king and the evolving leader, the alpha who'd learned that love wasn't weakness and was terrified of what that meant. "I still don't know if I can sustain this," he said quietly. "If I can be both strong enough to protect everything and vulnerable enough to stay human. Then we figure it out one crisis at a time, together." "Together," he echoed, like a vow, like a promise, like the beginning of something that might actually last. 6 months after the battle that changed everything, Celine stood on the battlements watching the sunrise. Shadowmoor had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The courtyards that once held only warriors now hosted traders and diplomats. The halls that echoed with threats now carried negotiations and laughter. The empire built on fear was becoming an alliance built on choice. It wasn't perfect. There were still conflicts, still territories that tested the new system's limits, still moments when Kael's brutality surfaced and he had to fight to channel it into something constructive. But it was working, slowly, imperfectly, humanly. Kael joined her on the battlements carrying 2 mugs of something hot. He'd started this ritual a month ago, mornings together before the demands of ruling consumed the day. "The Eastern Raiders," he said, handing her a mug. "Trial concluded yesterday. Leaders were opportunistic predators, executed. The rest chose labor integration. How do you feel about it?" "Like I made the right choice for the wrong reasons. I wanted to execute all of them. The restraint wasn't natural. It was forced." He took a drink. "But it sent the right message. Raiders on 3 other borders surrendered immediately when they heard we were offering integration as an option. That would never have happened under the old system. Because the old system only offered death. This offers choice. This offers complexity, which is exhausting." But he said it without anger, just acknowledgement. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sunrise paint the castle walls gold. Below, the Alliance capital was waking up. An empire of 12 territories bound by treaty instead of terror. It was fragile. It required constant maintenance. It could collapse if they made the wrong choice at the wrong moment. But it was real, and it was theirs. "I've been thinking about the prophecy," Celine said finally, "about what it actually meant." "And?" "It said I'd destroy your reign, and I did. The throne built on fear is gone. But the prophecy never said you'd fall with it, just that the reign would be destroyed." She looked at him. "Maybe that was the point all along. Not to remove you from power, but to force you to rebuild power differently." Kael considered this. So the prophecy was about transformation, not destruction. Destruction through transformation. You can't build something new while clinging to what broke you. The old reign had to die so something better could grow. And you think what we're building is better? I think it's honest. I think it gives people actual choice. I think it might last longer than 3 years. She leaned into him. "I think you're becoming someone your father would recognize. Someone who leads through earning loyalty instead of enforcing it." Kael's arm went around her waist. "My father got killed for being too merciful." "Your father got killed by alphas who valued power over integrity. You're building a system where that kind of ambition is harder to sustain, where betrayal has actual costs beyond just execution." She turned to face him fully. "You're not your father. You're not the brutal king you became. You're something in between, someone who can be hard when necessary and human when possible. And you're the reason I can walk that line without falling completely to one side. No, you're the reason. I'm just here to remind you when you forget." He kissed her as the sun climbed higher. When they broke apart, Kael kept her close. "The council was wrong about a lot of things," he said quietly. "But they were right that the mate bond changed me. I can't make decisions the same way I did before. Can't calculate losses without feeling them. Can't rule through isolation because I'm not isolated anymore." "And that's a problem?" "It's a transformation. Whether it's a problem depends on whether what we're building survives." He looked out over the waking city. "But I'm choosing to believe it will. That cooperation beats coercion. That evolution is possible. That maybe after everything, there's a way to be strong without being monstrous." Celine rested her head against his chest, feeling his heartbeat through the leather. Steady, strong, human. The Omega who'd been marked for death had become the Luna who helped a king remember what he was fighting for. The alpha who'd ruled through fear had become the leader who was learning to rule through hope. The prophecy had been fulfilled in the most unexpected way possible, not through destruction, but through the courage to become something better than what trauma had created. It was messy. It was imperfect. It was the hardest thing either of them had ever done. But it was real. And it was theirs. And it was proof that even empires built on blood and fear could transform if the people leading them were willing to change. The sun rose higher over Shadowmoor. An alliance of territories woke to another day of imperfect cooperation. And on the battlements, two people who'd been prophesied to destroy each other stood together and watched their uncertain future unfold. The throne built on fear was gone. The empire of terror had fallen. The brutal king had evolved. And in his place stood something harder to define but infinitely more valuable. A leader who understood that true strength wasn't the absence of vulnerability, but the courage to be human while carrying the weight of power. The prophecy had promised destruction. What it delivered was transformation. And in the space between what was and what could be, Kyle and Celine were building something that might actually last. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Because it gave people choice. Because it recognized that empires didn't have to be built on the bones of the conquered to be strong. They just had to be built on something worth protecting, something worth fighting for, something worth the hard work of becoming better than the trauma that shaped you. And as the sun climbed higher over the Alliance capital, Kyle Draven, the Alpha King who'd learned that evolution was harder than domination, but infinitely more valuable, held his mate and watched the future they were building together. A future uncertain, a future complicated, a future that required constant work and endless compromise, but a future that was theirs, built not on fear, but on the radical choice to believe that people were worth the effort, that transformation was possible, that even the most brutal weapon could learn to be human again if someone cared enough to show them how. The Omega marked for death had saved the king who was supposed to kill her. The prophecy fulfilled through mercy instead of power. The empire reborn through the courage to admit that fear wasn't the only foundation. And somewhere in the ruins of the old reign, something new was growing. Fragile, uncertain, completely dependent on two people choosing each other every day despite the constant pressure to revert to what was brutal and familiar. But that choice, that daily recommitment to evolution over stagnation, was the real prophecy, the real power, the real transformation. Not destruction, but the courage to destroy what needed to fall so something better could rise. The sun continued climbing, the empire of Alliance continued its imperfect growth, and Kyle and Celine stood together on the battlements, two people who'd found each other in the wreckage and decided that maybe the ruins were exactly where new things began. The prophecy was complete. The transformation was ongoing. The future was uncertain. But they faced it together, changed, vulnerable, human, exactly what the world needed from its leaders all along.